Helene Prusinski was born on April 6, 1958, in Huntington, which was located near New York City. She was the youngest of three children. Her brother and sister were 12 and 9 years old, respectively. The girl grew up in love and care, got along well with her older relatives, and was a positive, bright person. When she was 14, her father received a job offer, and the family had to move to the small town of Hamilton, near Boston. There she enrolled in the local school, where she developed a passion for singing and sports. At the same time, Helen decided that she wanted to tie her future life with journalism. After high school, she enrolled at Wheaton College, 110 kilometers from her town. It was close enough to visit her family regularly. In addition, the institution offered a truly quality education in journalism. Helen quickly adapted to student life, doing well in school and taking an active part in college life. Eventually, she had an opportunity she was looking forward to. She was to go to an internship at a radio news station located in Denver. Despite the fact that the city was more than 3,000 miles away from her college, Helene was excited about the opportunity. In addition, her uncle and aunt lived in Denver and agreed to take her in for the internship. With her also went a classmate who studied journalism. In January 1980, Helen, then 21, flew to Denver and began working at a radio station. Every day she had to take the bus from the office to her home. The trip took about 30 minutes, after which she had to walk several miles. On January 16th, she left the radio station as usual at 6 p.m. and went to the bus stop. The only thing was that she never showed up at home. Her aunt immediately began to worry because Helen had always warned her before if she planned to be somewhere late. The woman waited a few hours, but at 11:30, she decided to go to the police after all. Investigators had already begun a search immediately, fearing that her disappearance might be connected to a recent string of attacks on women in the area. They combed the area along Helen's route all night, but could not find her. In the morning, a woman approached the police. She was driving her car through a suburban area of Denver with her children. At one point, they noticed someone lying in a field near the road. The mother stopped the car, walked closer, and saw the body of a young girl with no signs of life. The police arrived on the scene and immediately identified Helen. Her clothes were partially missing, her hands were tied behind her back, and all her personal belongings were also missing. Later, medical experts determined that the girl had been stabbed 9 times and abused. The death occurred between 8 and 10 p.m. Police were able to find a witness who saw Helene get off the bus at about 5:30. She had several kilometers to walk from the bus stop, and it appears that the perpetrator attacked her at that point. Law enforcement agencies surveyed the area near where the body was found, but they were unable to find almost any clues other than shoe impressions, presumably size 44, that led from the road to the body and back. By then, medical examiners had found biological material on the victim's body and clothing that appeared to belong to the killer. Except that in those years, it could not help the investigation because the science of studying DNA was only at an early stage of development, but the samples were sent to a laboratory for storage, hoping that they would help identify the perpetrator in the future. Police turned to the public for information, using newspapers and local television. They tried to find witnesses who might have seen Helen that night. Soon they were approached by a woman who, at about 10:20 p.m., saw a man near the field where the body was found. He was standing on the side of the road next to a car. Unfortunately, it was dark outside at the time, and the woman could not get a good look at the man. She provided the police with only generalities that could not help them in any way. Then the detectives took a very interesting step. With the consent of the witness, they invited a hypnotist to the station, and the woman was able to remember more details on the basis of which it turned out to draw a portrait of this unknown man. It is hard to say whether the hypnosis session really helped the investigation, but the fact remains that at that time, the police had nothing but this drawing, but they could not find a single suspect, and the case froze for years. 6 months later, Helen was posthumously awarded her college diploma as a mark of remembrance. In addition, school officials established an alumni award named in her honor. This award was given for the active participation in college life that had been inherent in Helen throughout her studies. The investigation was not reopened until 1998, 18 years after the murder. By then, technology in the field of DNA research had progressed markedly, and researchers had entered samples of biological material into the FBI database. Unfortunately, no matches were found. This meant that the perpetrator had no previous criminal convictions, at least not since they began taking DNA samples from convicts. 15 more years passed, and in 2013, the local police department created a unit to handle unsolved cases. They reopened the investigation into Helen's murder, but no new leads could be found. A DNA sample from the victim's body never showed up in the FBI database. This meant that the girl's killer had not come to the attention of the police for other possible crimes all this time. Throughout all these years, Helen's relatives and police were not the only ones trying to find the truth. The girl's high school friends, with whom she was in the choir, took an active part in the investigation. Decades after her murder, they continued to press detectives to review the case regularly. They also gave interviews to get the story out to the public and distributed flyers about Helen's murder along her bus route. In 2017, the case was reopened again, and this time, the detectives had much more to go on. By this point, forensics had begun to make extensive use of genetic genealogy, by which the perpetrator's identity could be deduced through his relatives. Of course, this was a very complicated and time-consuming process. Moreover, this method worked only in the case if the relatives of the DNA possessor were in the publicly available genetic databases. There are several of these, and they are mostly used to search for family members. In 2018, police turned over available DNA samples to the Parabon lab, which had already helped solve hundreds of similar cases. Experts had about 3,000 matches to examine, including even the most distant relatives of the alleged killer. Then they had to sift out those who didn't fit the age or who couldn't commit the crime for other reasons. Ultimately, the experts determined that the person with the DNA was very likely the son of a woman named June Estes, who was no longer alive at the time. The problem was that she had 4 sons, but the lab was only able to identify 2 of them. They were 10 and 11 years old at the time of the murder, so they were ruled out right away. The search for the other 2 sons dragged on, and experts began to explore other options. Another year passed before something unexpected happened. A woman named Jessie entered her DNA sample into a public database, which was the primary tool for finding criminals. Experts at Parabon immediately saw that Jessie was a fairly close relative of Helen's killer and contacted her. In a more detailed DNA examination, the experts determined that Jessie's 3rd cousin was the killer. Detectives asked the woman for information about her family to finally identify the suspect, and luckily, Jessie was into podcasts about various crimes like Helen's murder. It was for this reason that she put her information into the open database. After all, genetic genealogy can be used to find a person through even the most distant relatives, and Jessie knew she could help solve a case with her decision. However, she could not have imagined that this would happen immediately after uploading her data into the database. The woman began collecting information about her family tree and asked both of her parents to enter their DNA into the database. Through this, experts at Parabon determined that the killer was related to Jesse on her father's side. Unfortunately, the search for an answer will drag on for several more months. Experts, detectives, and Jesse's family worked together to get closer to the owner of the DNA from the murder scene, and soon it finally happened. The cops were able to reach a relative of June Estes, and he gave new details about her older sons. It turned out that the woman suffered from mental problems, and after her next breakdown, her father took the boys and took them to another town. Their names were William and Curtis, and the detectives were to find out which one of them was the killer. The answer was not long in coming. The cops immediately discovered that William had been incarcerated multiple times, and his DNA sample was entered into the FBI database in 2010. Given that the sample from Helen's body has been run through that database repeatedly since then, William was not the killer. The downside of this database is that it only shows a full match, not a partial match, even when brothers are involved. As a result, 39 years after the murder, the police had a prime suspect, Curtis White, who also used the last name Clanton. It turned out that this man also had a rich criminal history under his belt. When he was 18 years old, he knocked on a woman's door and asked to use her phone. Once inside, he grabbed a knife and abused the victim before fleeing. He was quickly caught and imprisoned for 30 years, except he was released after 4 years. He was released early because he was defended by an employee of a Christian institution for troubled teens, where Curtis had been before his majority for stealing a car. This man said he would be willing to house the offender in his home and find him a job. It's hard to imagine how you can bring a convicted felon into your home with your wife and 5 children, but this man asked the court to release Curtis on those terms. Upon his release, Curtis moved in and took a job as a gardener. At the time of Helen's murder, he was living in that area. He later moved to Florida, where the detectives went in 2019. Curtis was 62 years old at the time, working as a trucker. Before charging him with Helen's murder, investigators wanted more hard evidence. They monitored the man for about a week in an attempt to secretly obtain a sample of his DNA. First, they removed a milk carton from his trash can and sent it to the lab. Experts found someone's DNA on it, but there was too little to analyze. On November 30th, detectives followed him to a bar where the suspect drank several bottles of beer from the same glass. As soon as he left, that glass was seized and shipped to a lab in Colorado. It took almost a month to transport and examine, but eventually, the detectives had the long-awaited result in their hands. The sample from the victim's body matched Curtis's DNA exactly. He was arrested on December 11 and charged with Helen's murder. The man denied any involvement in the case, so the prosecutor was preparing to take the case to court, and the man himself was extradited to Colorado, and here, something unexpected happened. On the way there, he began to gradually confess to what he had done. The detectives who accompanied him listened to all the details of the crime. Curtis said he was driving down the street and noticed a lonely girl getting off the bus. Pulling out a knife, he forced her into his car for the purpose of committing acts of violence. He then drove her out of town, abused her, and killed her. As a result, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Considering that he will be 82 years old by then, the perpetrator may well not live to see that day. Unfortunately, most of Helen's own relatives did not wait for the killer to be punished either. Her parents and older brother had passed away many years before, and only her older sister survived. Nearly 40 years later, the elderly woman received a call from the police station, finally informing her that the case had been solved. There remains one more creepy moment in this whole story. As you may recall, at the time of Helen's murder, there were repeated incidents of abuse of women in Denver, and these crimes had a common MO. Now detectives think Curtis was behind them, but they can no longer prove it. Helen McCourt was born on July 29, 1965, in the English town of Bootle. Soon she had a younger brother, and from an early age, the girl helped take care of him. Later, their parents divorced, her mother married another man, and they, along with Helen and her brother, moved to a small village called Billing. Located near the city, it was a quiet, peaceful place where not a single serious crime could occur for decades. The locals knew each other well and were not afraid that something bad could happen in their village. Helen grew up in this peaceful environment, had many friends, and was an exemplary daughter. After graduating from school, she got a job at an insurance company located in Liverpool. The young woman stayed in Billing, so she had to get to the office by train and bus. On February 9, 1988, when Helen was 22 years old, she went to work as usual. She had agreed to have lunch with her mother that day since her mother worked just a few streets away from her. However, the weather suddenly turned bad that day with strong winds and rain, so they decided to postpone their lunch. Her mother came home significantly earlier, and Helen called her towards the end of her shift. She told her mother that she had planned to go on a date that evening and asked her to heat up dinner for her arrival so that she could wash her hair. Usually, Helen returned home just after 5 p.m., but that day she was clearly delayed, and her mother began to worry. However, soon after, the news reported that a fallen tree on one of the railroad lines, due to the bad weather, had temporarily paralyzed the train service. By 7 p.m., her mother began to worry again and decided to call the railroad service. She explained the situation, but the operator stated that the fallen tree had blocked another road and it did not affect the train schedules that Helen would have taken. At that moment, the woman began to seriously consider that something had happened to her daughter. Firstly, Helen almost always returned home from work on time. Secondly, she would always call home and inform them if she planned to stay out late. Although there were no mobile phones back then, Helen could have made a call from work or any telephone booth, which were found almost on every corner. The mother thought that Helen might have been in trouble due to the bad weather. For example, she might have fallen due to the heavy rain and wind and hurt herself. The woman and her son then started calling local hospitals in all nearby towns, but no one resembling Helen had been admitted. The mother also considered the possibility that her daughter might have stayed late at work and called the office, but they told her that Helen had left several hours ago. None of her friends knew where she was either. Afterwards, Helen's mother, stepfather, and boyfriend decided to go on a search. They walked along the road that Helen used to take home from work. Helen always took the same route, taking a train from Liverpool to the small town of St. Helens and then taking a bus to Billing. However, they were unable to find her, so the family decided to contact the police. They first notified officers in Liverpool and the surrounding areas, distributing descriptions of the missing young woman, but no one was able to find her. The next morning, when Helen had still not returned home or contacted anyone, the police decided to retrace her steps and reconstruct the timeline of events from the previous evening. They wanted to understand at what point along her journey from work to home she went missing. To do this, investigators appealed to the public for witnesses. They also spoke with Helen's colleagues, employees at the train station, and bus company. As a result, they came to an unexpected conclusion. They were able to confirm that on the night of her disappearance, she not only took a train, but also a bus to her village. This was strange because the bus stop was only 200 meters from her home. Detectives began to suspect that she might have been abducted because if it was an accident, she would have been discovered by now. As part of the standard procedure, detectives began to investigate people close to Helen, since in most cases, they are the ones behind such crimes. Her boyfriend and stepfather had reliable alibis for that evening, and Helen's friends and acquaintances were also excluded from the list of possible suspects. Forming search teams of 120 officers, the police began a detailed search of the area between the bus stop and Helen's house, hoping to find any clues, such as a piece of her clothing or something that the potential kidnapper might have dropped. At the same time, leaflets with information about the missing young woman were distributed in nearby towns. Divers searched local water bodies, and police officers knocked on every door, questioning people. They also went to all the shops, bars, and cafes in Billings. After talking to the staff at a bar called George and Dragon, they got their first lead. This establishment was located near Helen's house, and she occasionally went there with her friends. But investigators found out that just 2 days before her disappearance, the bar owner banned her from the bar after an incident. She had had a quarrel with a drunk woman who spilled her drink on her. Helen didn't want to provoke the conflict and went to the toilet to try to clean her clothes, but the drunken woman followed her and started acting aggressively. At some point, she even tried to hit her, after which the bar owner kicked them both out. Moreover, he forbade them from ever returning. The police decided to learn more about this conflict and went to the bar the next day to talk to its owner, Ian Simpson. Moreover, this establishment was located right between the bus stop and Helen's house. The man told detectives about that evening and said that he had to kick both young women out so that their conflict didn't disturb other visitors. During their conversation, the bar slowly filled with people and it became noisy. Then the police suggested that Ian ride with them to the station to continue the dialogue in a more peaceful environment. And here, something strange happened. The man noticeably became nervous, refused to go with them, and tried to end the conversation. All of this seemed suspicious to investigators. Why was Ian so afraid to go to the station? Perhaps he had something to do with Helen's disappearance, or he knew more than he said. They decided to keep an eye on him and found out that the man was known for his philandering. Despite being a married man with 2 children, Ian constantly flirted with other women, and all the villagers knew about it. The police also found out that he constantly paid attention to Helen when she came to the bar. The investigators once again approached him and asked where he was on the evening of Helen's disappearance. The man explained that he was spending time with his lover in an apartment located above a bar. According to him, he spent most of his time there because he was afraid that his establishment could be robbed. The detective spoke with his lover, and here they encountered an interesting twist. The woman claimed that she and Ian had indeed planned to meet at his apartment at around 7 p.m. However, that evening, he called her and asked her to come a few hours later. In the end, she arrived at around 8:30, but the man wasn't home. He returned only around 11:30. All of this looked extremely suspicious. Obviously, Ian lied to the police about his alibi, which automatically made him a suitable candidate for the role of suspect. One more detail seemed strange to the detectives. The man had several fresh scratches on his neck. He said he got them during a fight with his wife when she found out about his lover. However, the investigators spoke with the woman and she denied scratching her husband. The police spoke with Ian again and he changed his story. Now the man claimed that he got the scratches while separating Helen and another drunk young woman on the evening when a scuffle happened in the bar. The detective spoke with this young woman, but she denied this story. According to her, they didn't come to blows and none of them scratched the bar owner. Soon, the police got a witness who told them a worrying fact. On the evening of Helen's disappearance, he was passing through that street and at some point heard a piercing female scream. it was coming from the bar, but it quickly cut off. Based on all this, the detectives began to think that 31-year-old Ian Sims had a direct connection to the Helen's disappearance. However, he continued to deny everything. The investigators needed serious evidence to tie him to this case. Otherwise, they would be powerless. Police decided to search his car, where they found two gruesome pieces of evidence. Firstly, they found several blood stains, and secondly, a part of a woman's earring was lying on the floor. They immediately took the earring to Helen's mother, who, without a doubt, confirmed that it belonged to her daughter. After that, Ian was arrested on charges of kidnapping and murder, even though the police still didn't know what had happened to Helen. They searched the bar and the apartment on the second floor, where they found new evidence. In both places, there were many barely noticeable bloodstains that had clearly been attempted to be washed away. On one of these spots, the criminalists found a fingerprint that belonged to Ian. Moreover, in the apartment, they found the missing part of the same earring that was previously discovered in his car. Despite such an impressive set of evidence, the man continued to deny everything. By this point, the police thought that Helen was dead. They needed to find her body. Otherwise, the court could justify Ian. They believed that the blood in his apartment and car belonged to the young woman. But in those years, DNA analysis was just beginning to be used in forensics, and organizing such research was very problematic. The man himself told the police that the blood belonged to his dog, which injured its paw. In an attempt to find more evidence, investigators decided to appeal to the public to organize more extensive searches. More than 2,000 people responded to their call, including both residents of the village and nearby settlements. Together with the police, they searched the area around Billing, including forests and fields. Soon, a new piece of evidence did appear in this case, but it was not discovered by volunteers. 25 kilometers from the village, in a place called Collins Green, a man walking his dog noticed a towel on the ground with traces of blood. He looked around and saw another such towel, as well as several pillowcases. In addition, he found men's socks, a sweater, and underwear nearby. Some of these items were also covered in blood. He reported his findings to the police, and they took the items to a storage facility for evidence. But here was one problem. Considering that this area was 25 kilometers from Billing, police officers from another department arrived at the call, and they did not connect this find with Helen McCord's case. And the investigators who were searching for her didn't even know about the discovery of the bloody items. In the end, the police eventually saw a connection between the cases, and the inscription on the found sweater helped them. It was a print with an advertisement for a beer brand that was being sold on promotion at the George and Dragon Bar at the time. Learning this, investigators concluded that all of these things, with a high degree of probability, belonged to Ian Sims. Thus, the detectives had numerous blood samples, but they did not have Helen's body to request a DNA analysis. It was 1988, and such tools were not yet widely used. The police decided to compare the blood samples from the bar, Ian's car, and the witnesses found items with the blood of Helen's closest relatives, her parents and younger brother. The results showed that these samples were very close, and the blood almost certainly belonged to close relatives. Thus, the detectives were convinced that the blood samples belonged to Helen. This unequivocally indicated that Ian was clearly involved in her disappearance, but they still needed more evidence. The problem was that the expression, "no body, no case," did not appear out of nowhere. The British court rarely passed guilty verdicts in murder cases if the victim's body was not found. No matter how weighty the evidence may have seemed in the eyes of justice, there was always a slight chance that the victim might not be dead. The police hoped that they would be able to gather more information against Ian, so they questioned all of his acquaintances. After talking to the bar cleaner, they learned about another suspicious incident. The woman told them that on the morning after Helen's disappearance, she came to work as usual to clean the premises. To her surprise, she saw the owner himself doing a general cleaning. He was washing the floors, walls, and tables. Moreover, judging by the scale of the work, he had been doing it for more than an hour. The problem was that this had never happened before. Ian had never participated in cleaning his bar, and in general, he rarely got up so early. Usually, when the cleaner came for her morning shift, the man was still sleeping in his apartment upstairs. When she asked him why he had suddenly decided to clean the entire premises himself, Ian replied that his dog had made a mess. Another witness told the police that he had passed by this bar at night and heard the sound of a working vacuum cleaner from inside. The police concluded that Ian had been trying to get rid of the bloodstains all night, but he had not been able to completely complete the task. Despite all this, even with the suspicion surrounding Ian, they still needed more evidence. Investigators tried to find the young woman's body, but even extensive searches yielded no results. A month later, another piece of evidence fell into their hands. A man was walking along the river, about 30 kilometers from Billings, and noticed a woman's purse in the grass. Looking inside, he found documents in the name of Helen McCord. The police arrived at the scene, and soon they found even more evidence. Nearby, they discovered the clothing the young woman was wearing on the day of her disappearance, as well as a second earring identical to the one found in Ian's car. But a more horrific discovery awaited the detectives. A coiled cable was lying near the clothes, tangled with female hair. They were sent to the laboratory, and soon the experts confirmed that the hair belonged to Helen McCord. Examining the young woman's purse, investigators found a check from a pharmacy in St. Helens. It turned out that she went there shopping on the evening of her disappearance, just before taking the bus to Billings. The police found all the items purchased at the pharmacy near the purse, except for one, a toothbrush. But soon they found it too, not 30 kilometers from the village next to the purse, but in the same bar as Ian Simpson, where investigators were still conducting extensive searches. They also managed to find a hairpin, and Helen's mother confirmed that the young woman went to work with her that morning. But that was not all. In the bar, they found a clump of female hair that belonged to Helen, confirmed by DNA analysis. Despite all of this, the detectives continued to cling to every detail and handed over the woman's clothing to the laboratory. After a thorough examination, forensic experts found traces of carpet on it, identical to the one in the George and Dragon bar. In addition, they found traces of dog hair on the clothing, which matched the hair of Ian's dog. After that, the experts began to study 2 rings and a bracelet that were seized from the man after his arrest. Forensic experts found traces of dirt on them and compared them with the soil in the area where bloody towels and Ian's clothing were found. As surprising as it may sound, they were able to prove that the dirt was from that region, which once again confirmed that the man was there and had himself thrown away these things. Soon after this, the police found another piece of evidence. Near the town of Rixton, located 24 kilometers from Billings, they found a shovel. They were able to determine that the shovel belonged to Ian Simpson, and apparently he used it to bury Helen's body. However, they still couldn't find the body itself, despite the constant work of hundreds of volunteers. The young woman's relatives were almost 100% sure that she was dead. With such a colossal set of evidence, waiting for a miracle was simply pointless. Yet they couldn't finally confirm this and give her a decent burial, as well as be sure that the perpetrator would be punished. Ian continued to insist that he had nothing to do with the murder and eventually the police handed the case over to the court. The trial began a year after Helen's disappearance in February 1989. This was one of the first cases in Britain where a person was tried for murder in the absence of the victim's body. Therefore, despite the huge amount of evidence, the prosecution doubted their victory. According to their version, that evening Helen got off the bus and headed home along her usual route. When she passed by the George and Dragon Bar, Ian Simpson noticed her and started talking to her on some pretext. Perhaps the man was trying to discuss with her the incident that led to him banning her from his establishment. Then he must have lured her inside somehow. According to the investigation, Ian could have offered to resolve the conflict and lift the ban on her visiting the bar. Considering that this was practically the only place in Billings where Helen could go with her friends, she was interested in resolving the conflict. Apparently, the man lured her inside the building where there was no one else at the time. Almost immediately after that, he attacked her, which was confirmed by the testimony of a passing witness. He heard a female scream that was quickly cut off. Attacking Helen, Ian killed her with an electric cable and dragged her into his second-floor apartment. There, he possibly subjected the young woman to violence, after which he waited for darkness and loaded the body into his car. The man drove her away from Billings and buried her, after which he scattered her things, his clothes, and other items in other remote places. There were several versions regarding his motives. The first one was forced. From the testimony of many witnesses, the investigation knew that Ian had repeatedly shown signs of attention to the young woman, but she always refused him. Probably that evening, he saw an opportunity to fulfill his criminal desires. The second version was that during their conversation, some conflict arose between them and he killed her in a fit of rage. It is possible that he and Helen began to argue, and she threatened to tell his wife about his constant harassment. However, this theory looked less realistic. After the prosecution spoke in court, it was Ian's turn. He still claimed that he was completely innocent and told his version, and it was one of the strangest speeches ever made by a man accused of murder. The man claimed that someone framed him. Someone else sneaked into the bar, put on his clothes, lured Helen there, and killed her. After that, he put her body in Ian's car and buried it with Ian's shovel in an unknown place. After all of this, the killer drove the car back to the bar and disappeared, framing the innocent bar owner. After such statements, the jurors became even more convinced that Ian was directly involved in the murder. His story sounded completely absurd. Perhaps he already understood that he would most likely go to prison and decided to make fun of the justice system and the victim's relatives. As a result, on March 14, 1989, the man was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to apply for parole no earlier than 16 years in prison. Unfortunately for Helen's family, it was far from the end. The police and volunteers continued to search for her body, but without success. 3 years after the sentencing, the young woman's mother wrote a letter to the killer, desperately pleading to reveal the location of her daughter's body. After some time, Ian replied, but his letter contained only insults and threats. He promised to take revenge on the woman as soon as he was released from prison. The killer repeatedly appealed, but all his appeals were rejected. Only in 2004, when he had already spent 15 years behind bars, one of the appeals was granted, and the case was sent for review. However, it did not play in the killer's favor. With the help of modern DNA analysis tools, experts examined the evidence and concluded that all of them unequivocally proved Ian's guilt. As a result, the case review essentially led to an increase in the prison sentence. After 16 years, the criminal repeatedly applied for release, but all his applications were rejected. Meanwhile, Helen's family continued to fight to find her body. In 2015, her mother launched a public campaign seeking to change existing laws. She demanded that convicted murderers be denied early release until they disclosed the location of their victim's body. The woman gave interviews to various channels, wrote letters to Prime Minister Theresa May, and also created a petition that gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. As a result, this issue was brought to Parliament for consideration, and initially, politicians positively assessed the possibility of passing such a law. However, time passed, and Helen's Mother initiative was constantly delayed. All these delays led to the fact that in November 2019, after 30 years of imprisonment, Ian Sims finally achieved early release. This event was a heavy blow to the young woman's family, as they had practically lost any hope of finding the location of her remains. 3 months after the decision was made, the killer was released. 63-year-old Ian Sims returned to a normal life. However, he did not enjoy his freedom for long. In late June 2022, the man died from an illness, taking the secret of Helen's body's location with him to the grave. Helen's mother is still alive and does not plan to give up. She now hopes that Ian may have told someone among his cellmates where he hid the body. She also continues to fight for the adoption of a law that would prohibit the early release of murderers who refuse to disclose the location of their victim. Thus, the Helen McCourt case lasted for several decades, although it was solved in a matter of days. Despite the overwhelming evidence against the criminal, he continued to keep secret information that would have allowed the relatives of his victim to say goodbye to her and start to heal their wounds. Samantha Koenig was born August 30th, 1993 in Anchorage, Alaska. The state's largest population center is characterized by a quiet, measured lifestyle, a harsh climate, and vast expanses surrounded by snow-capped mountains. The girl loved animals very much, so after school she planned to find a job related to them. Another option for her was a career as a doctor. Samantha even considered applying to the Navy as a nurse. In her spare time, she worked part-time at a Subway restaurant and a Harley-Davidson dealership. In early 2012, when she was 18, she found another part-time job at a small chain coffee shop downtown. Samantha was excited about the opportunity. First of all, the job was easy enough. Secondly, she had to be alone on her shift, so the whole work process depended solely on her. Her boyfriend, however, did not share this enthusiasm. He was worried about Samantha having to work through the night alone and tried to talk her out of it. But eventually, he supported her decision on the condition that he would pick her up after each shift. She assured him that the coffee shop was full of cameras and even had a panic button to call the police. Even though the coffee shop was in the middle of nowhere, it was a fairly deserted area, like most of Anchorage. The city has low population density, so even in the downtown area, you can see empty streets. Also, the daylight hours are short in winter in Alaska, so Samantha had to work a lot during the hours of darkness. Samantha fell in love with the job and quickly got the hang of it. By early February, she had already worked there for a month, and on the first of the month, she was getting ready to finish her shift at 8 p.m. as usual. A customer came out 5 minutes before the coffee shop closed and ordered a large Americano. Samantha prepared the drink and turned to the window to give it to the customer. He took the glass and immediately pointed a gun at the young woman. An unidentified man in a ski mask stated that he was going to rob her and demanded that the lights in the coffee shop be turned off. Samantha complied, and the offender immediately broke in through the window. A surveillance camera caught the whole thing, but those silent witnesses could not help her. Frightened by the armed robber, she also did not press the panic button. Once inside the coffee shop, the perpetrator tied Samantha up and asked where her car was parked. The young woman replied that she didn't have one and added that her boyfriend would be here any minute to pick her up. The man then took her outside and headed for his car. While he was looking around, Samantha managed to break free and ran, but the perpetrator quickly caught up with her and grabbed her. Unfortunately, there was not a soul on the street at the time, so no one could help her. The man said that if she tried to run away again, he would kill her. He then led the young woman across the street to his pickup truck and put her in the passenger seat. The perpetrator had obviously prepared in advance, since the license plates had been taken off the car. As he drove her to an unknown destination, the man stated that he only wanted a ransom from her family and that Samantha could then go home. He still did not show her his face, which was concealed by a ski mask. All along the way, the young woman tried to convince him to let her go and told him that her family didn't have much money, but the kidnapper wouldn't listen. At one point, he asked Samantha where her phone was. The young woman replied that she had left it in a coffee shop, and this enraged the perpetrator. He needed the phone for his ransom plan. So he went back to the coffee shop to get the smartphone and sent 2 messages from it to Samantha's boss and to her boyfriend. In them, the kidnapper wrote on the young woman's behalf that she was tired and would go out of town with friends for a few days. All the while, Samantha was in his pickup truck. After texting, the kidnapper removed the battery from the phone and got behind the wheel again. He drove the young woman to an undisclosed location that looked like a barn and told her to sit quietly. The man stated that if she tried to scream, he would kill her. He also added that he had a police scanner, and if she somehow managed to call for help, he would know right away. The perpetrator demanded Samantha's credit card, but things were not so simple here. The young woman said she shared a bank account with her boyfriend, and the card was in his possession. So the man decided to steal it. Having first learned the boyfriend's address and PIN number, he left the tied-up Samantha alone and went to get the card. The young woman told him it was always in the guy's car. Once there, the perpetrator saw the right car and started breaking it open. At that very moment, the guy spotted it from the window and rushed outside, but he was too late. The kidnapper took out the card and quickly fled. On the way back, he stopped at an ATM to check the PIN number, then returned to Samantha's house. Meanwhile, the young woman's relatives and boyfriend were in a panic. The guy didn't believe for a second that the message was written to her, and everyone understood that something bad had happened to Samantha. But at that moment, none of them connected the theft of the credit card with the disappearance of the young woman. The guy didn't even think the events could be connected in any way. By nightfall, Samantha's family contacted the police and they began a search. Of course, the first thing they did was to look through the camera footage in the coffee shop and immediately witnessed her abduction. Soon the FBI got involved, but they could not find any serious leads. The perpetrator had clearly prepared carefully for the kidnapping. Not a single detail that could be used to identify him was caught on camera. Meanwhile, the young woman's relatives, with the help of concerned people, raised the $41,000 they had promised for information on Samantha's whereabouts. The parents were constantly being interviewed by local TV stations, begging for any information about their daughter's fate. Flyers with Samantha's picture and information about the reward appeared all over Anchorage, but the police never received a single valuable witness. As the days passed, detectives desperate for answers began checking everyone Samantha knew, including her boyfriend and relatives, but they quickly determined that none of them had anything to do with the kidnapping. Nearly a month passed. On February 24, Samantha's boyfriend received a new message from her number saying, "Connor, park sign, under Albert's picture. Isn't she cute?" Investigators immediately realized it was about the local Connor's dog park and, along with the young woman's relatives, headed there. After a while, they saw what the kidnapper meant. There was a booth in the park with various flyers, among which was a photo of a dead dog named Albert. The owners placed this flyer on the stand to say goodbye to their pet, but the detectives noticed a plastic bag underneath it. When they opened it, they saw a Polaroid photo of Samantha in the background with a newspaper from February 13 and the letter written on a typewriter in which the kidnapper demanded that $30,000 be deposited in her bank account. He promised to kill the young woman if these conditions were not met. The police and the FBI immediately devised a plan that could help them catch this thoughtful criminal. They told the young woman's father to top up the card in installments so that the kidnapper would have to repeatedly go to the ATMs. he did just that. First, the man deposited $5,000, and a few hours later, that money was withdrawn from one of the Anchorage ATMs. The kidnapper was caught on camera, but even here, the detectives were unsuccessful. The man was wearing a hat, a hood, glasses, and what appeared to be a false beard and mustache. It was impossible to identify him from the photograph. The police immediately arrived at the ATM, but the perpetrator had already fled. A week later, the thief withdrew another batch of money in Willcox, Arizona, the opposite end of the United States. He traveled 6,000 miles to throw off investigators, but they continued to monitor his activities. The next cash withdrawal occurred in Lordsburg, New Mexico, just an hour away from Arizona. Following that, he made 2 more withdrawals in different cities in Texas. In the meantime, police carefully examined ATM photos. They soon realized that the criminal had made a huge mistake in Willcox. He had left his car in the camera's line of sight, so the detectives now knew the model of his car. Of course, it was impossible to make out the license plates in such a picture, but now they had something to work with. Investigators feared the kidnapper might cross the border into Mexico, so all patrols were instructed to stop white Ford Focuses. A few days later, on March 13, a Texas Highway Patrol spotted a vehicle of that make in a hotel parking lot. There was a man sitting behind the wheel. The officer decided to wait for him to pull up and follow him. Soon the man drove out of the parking lot and along the highway. As soon as the driver exceeded the allowable speed limit of 3 miles, the patrolman ordered him to pull over at the curb. This was done to put the suspect's vigilance to sleep. If a dangerous criminal is behind the wheel, he may be armed and ready to fight back to the last man. So the patrolman pretended that the reason for the stop was a minor infraction. The driver of the white Ford turned out to be 34-year-old Israel Keys of Anchorage. The policeman was immediately alerted and decided to search his car, calling for backup in the process. Samantha's cell phone and her boyfriend's bank card were found in the car. They also found a gun, a false mustache, a beard, and dark glasses. Police had no doubt that he was behind Samantha's kidnapping, but they were still shocked because Keys had never come to their attention. The man had a perfectly clean criminal history. He lived with his girlfriend and 10-year-old daughter and ran his small construction business successfully. He was respected and trusted among his acquaintances. Even some members of the Anchorage prosecutor's office used his repair and construction services. But one question preoccupied everyone. Where was Samantha Gainey? Under questioning, Keys was extremely calm. He joked and laughed a lot. The FBI agents kept up the dialogue in his style, and after a while, he confessed what he had done. Keys stated that he had been planning to rob this coffee shop for several days. He did not know in advance if he would kidnap the employee. Moreover, he had worked out 2 rules which he himself broke: never look for victims near his own home and never transport them in his car. All of this made him hesitant as he stood in front of Samantha in a dark coffee shop. But he made the decision to act to the end. On the night of the kidnapping, he drove her to the shed in the backyard of his house, where his daughter and girlfriend were at the time. The perpetrator turned on the radio in case his victim tried to scream and left to get the bank card. When he returned, Israel quietly entered the house, trying not to wake his family, poured himself a glass of wine, and went into the barn. There, he abused Samantha and killed her. But what about this photo they found in the park? It had the February 13th issue of the newspaper from 2 weeks after the kidnapping, and Samantha appeared to be alive. But in fact, she had been dead all along, and there is no manipulation in the photo. Keys fixed her eyelids so that her eyes were open and applied makeup to her face. According to a detective who attended the interrogation, Israel recounted the details of the murder with such ease as if he were listing the foods he had eaten for breakfast. The perpetrator agreed to tell it all on the condition that the confession portion of the interrogation not be published. He did not want his daughter to hear it all. In doing so, he killed Samantha only a few dozen yards from her bedroom. The detectives already thought Key's story was nearing its end, but that was only the beginning. The morning after the murder, Israel and his family went on a sea cruise from the city of New Orleans. Tickets for it had been purchased in advance, and the perpetrator was well aware that he was committing this murder just hours before departure. Accordingly, he had to leave the body somewhere so that no one would discover it. Keyes did the simple thing and left it in the same barn. It was freezing outside, so the body quickly froze. When Keyes returned home 2 weeks later, he took a picture with a newspaper and used a typewriter to write a ransom letter. He then separated the body into pieces and went to a small lake, 40 minutes outside Anchorage. Using a chainsaw, he made holes in the ice where he placed bags of the body parts and additional weights. After all that, the maniac went winter fishing. It took police divers 10 hours to retrieve those bags from the bottom. Detectives also learned that during his trips between ATMs across the states, Keyes used a rental car, the same white Ford Focus. At one point, he had a malfunction and went to one of the dealerships to have the car changed. Surprisingly, that moment played a key role in catching the culprit. The car was caught on ATM camera before the breakdown, and all the police were looking for that particular model. The dealership gave him the same white Focus because they had no other suitable cars at the time. Had the situation been different, he would never have been stopped. In the end, during questioning, Keyes confirmed what the investigators had already guessed. Samantha was not his first victim. The perpetrator had promised to tell them about all the crimes he had committed in exchange for two conditions. First, he wanted a guaranteed death sentence and demanded that it be carried out within a year of being pronounced. Second, he asked that everything he said be kept secret from the press. These conditions surprised the detectives, but they saw no reason to refuse, and the maniac began to tell them horror stories. Israel began committing crimes at an early age. He would break into other people's houses, steal, set fires in the woods, and torture animals. His parents were deep believers, but they practiced a very questionable and unpopular branch of Christianity. Because of his parents' constantly shifting religious preferences, they regularly moved around the country. At the age of 20, Keyes joined the Army, where he spent 3 years. A few months before that, he had molested a random young woman after spotting her in an Oregon park. When questioned, Israel said he wanted to get out of the Army as soon as possible so he could start killing. After quitting at age 23, he began his killing streak. Keyes made weapons caches in the woods so he could go there at any time and start looking for victims. Police found 2 such caches in Anchorage and New York. Inside were money, knives, gun, and body disposal supplies. Over the next few years, he regularly went out hunting in different states, but the exact number of his victims is still unknown. The FBI has only been able to pinpoint 5 of them. But detectives believe Keyes committed at least 11 murders, and these are just the cases where many factors point to his involvement. In total, the number of murders could be as many as 30. In addition, Israel had been robbing banks, stores, and private homes so that he always had enough money to buy weapons and travel. In his hiding places, discovered after interrogations, he was found to have considerable cash reserves. Despite all this, the man has never come to the attention of the police, except on one occasion. In all interrogations, he denied his involvement, but detectives did not believe him. On March 3, 1996, a 12-year-old girl named Julie Harris disappeared. Israel Keyes, who was 16 at the time, lived in the same neighborhood. Police suspected him after a witness found Julie near Keyes shortly before her disappearance. It was not until a year later that the girl's remains were found in the river, and her killer was never caught. During interrogations after Samantha's murder, Keyes denied his involvement, but investigators were again reluctant to take his word for it. They did not, however, have any direct evidence. In a conversation with FBI agents, Israel admitted that he had studied serial killers since he was a child. His idol was Ted Bundy, and the maniac wanted to be like him. He felt no remorse for his victims and happily recounted how he managed to lead 2 completely different lives. On the one hand, he was a decent family man and businessman, and on the other, he was an inhuman killer. The only thing that gave any hint of feeling was that Keyes had asked the detectives to keep the details of his crimes from his daughter. He also stated that he had never killed children or anyone who had, again because of his own daughter. The FBI agents did not believe this, but they could not prove otherwise. They were all forced to admit that Israel was an extremely thoughtful maniac who had made only one mistake in his entire series of crimes. The investigators hoped that he would tell them all of his atrocities himself, but that never happened. 9 months after his arrest, Keyes took his own life in his cell. Even though FBI agents had spent hundreds of hours interrogating him up to that point, much he had withheld from them. 11 drawings depicting skulls were found under the bed in his cell. It is possible that each one symbolized the victim. The picture of these drawings were not published until 2020. Thus, Israel Keyes can be considered one of the most violent and elaborate maniacs. He managed to maintain an impeccable reputation, committing dozens of different crimes, always getting away with it. If he hadn't left his car in camera view, he might never have been caught. Investigators had no doubt that if he had, he would have continued to kill. Keyes himself said he saw killing as his purpose in life and planned to continue hunting people until he was caught. Marlene Warren was born on April 15, 1950, in Michigan, USA. She grew up without a father and since her teenage years dreamed of having a large and close-knit family. Very soon, that dream came true. The girl married a man named John, and they had 2 sons. But just a few years later, an unexpected tragedy struck the family. Marlene's husband died suddenly of an illness, and the woman was left alone with 2 small children. Since then, she has spent most of her time at work, trying to provide for her sons alone. Although she struggled with this, she sacrificed everything for her children. 6 years after her husband's death, she met a man named Michael Warren, and they soon married. The man was a used car salesman, and after their marriage, he opened his own business in that area. By that time, Marlene was already making good money, but instead of spending all her money, she tried to save it. The woman invested in Michael's company and also helped him in the management. The man himself was also good at this business, and in the following years, it began to bring them decent money. Over time, Marlene and her husband expanded the business. They bought several properties to rent, and their finances took off. The family moved to an upscale Miami suburb called Wellington, buying a large house there. They seemed to have built a near-perfect life. But in 1988, Marlene suffered another tragedy. Her oldest son was killed in a car accident. For the woman and her youngest son, Joseph, it was a huge blow. After all the difficulties they had gone through, their life had just got better when suddenly fate presented them with yet another test. Yet they found the strength to move on. After this tragedy, Marlene became even closer to Joseph because he was her only closest relative. Her husband also helped her to recover from this loss. After the death of her son, the woman began to think about selling the properties that she and Michael were renting out. Despite the fact that this business brought in good money, for Marlene it was associated with constant worries. There were often situations when tenants delayed rent or lost income altogether. In each such case, the woman did her best to find the best solution. It was very hard for her to put people on the street because she was a good-natured person and well remembered the financial difficulties she experienced with 2 small children. On the other hand, she and her husband could not let people live in their homes for free, and eventually, Marlene wanted to get rid of the business so that she would no longer face such moral dilemmas. 2 years had passed since her son's death. The family was just beginning to recover and return to normalcy. But something terrible and unforeseen awaited them once again. On the morning of May 26, 1990, Marlene was at home with her son and 3 of his friends who came over for breakfast. Their kitchen was located so that they could see the driveway through the windows. At some point, the doorbell rang and Marlene went to open it. Her son saw a white Chrysler parked in front of their house. The next second, the woman opened the front door and saw a man in a clown costume holding 2 balloons and a bouquet of flowers on the doorstep. Marlene said, "How cute is that?" But the next second, something unexpected happened. The clown pulled a gun out of his pocket and shot the woman in the head. Her son and his friends rushed into the hallway where a heartbreaking sight awaited them. Marlene was lying on the floor with blood everywhere. The man in the clown suit looked at them for a few seconds, then got back into his car and drove away. My son called an ambulance, after which he decided to chase after his attacker. At the time, his leg was in a cast after an injury and the guy couldn't drive. He told his 2 friends to stay with his mother, asked his friend to drive, and drove with her in the direction the attacker had gone. But by that time, the clown was out of sight and they never managed to find him. Marlene was taken to the hospital in an unconscious state and the detectives began their investigation. The first thing they did was talk to everyone in the house. The woman's son said that he could not see any signs of his attacker. He was wearing a suit and makeup. He was wearing gloves on his hands and a wig on his head. The only thing the son remembered was that the perpetrator had very dark eyes. His friends added that the clown was quite tall and his shoes stood out strongly against the costume. They looked like work shoes. A neighbor who was walking his dog near Marlene's house also saw the clown, but he was unable to share any significant sightings with police. Investigators put out a search for a white Chrysler and began searching for other evidence. Of course, Marlene's husband, Michael, was the first to be suspected. That morning, he had just left for the racing stadium in Miami, and at the time of the attack on his wife, he was not at home. From the first hours of the investigation, the police had several good reasons to think about his involvement. First, they found out that Marlene and her relatives really liked clowns. There were a lot of pictures and figures depicting these characters in their house. This suggested that the attacker knew this fact and chose such an outfit for a reason. Secondly, just 2 hours after the incident, the police received an anonymous tip from a woman who called the investigators and said they should look into Michael Warren and a woman named Sheila Keene. Sheila, who was 26, worked with Michael at his car rental company. Digging deeper, the detectives learned of rumors that there was a secret affair between them. Their relationship had been speculated about by some colleagues, so they immediately shared this information with investigators. Here, the police discovered another possible motive. If Michael was in a relationship with another woman and wanted to break up with Marlene, he had one problem. Most of the real estate and business that the family owned were written down to his wife. In that case, Michael would lose an impressive part of his fortune in a divorce. The police immediately checked the man's whereabouts at the time of the attack, and it turned out that Michael was in a car about 110 kilometers away from the house and had 2 friends with him. Investigators concluded he would not have been physically capable of committing the crime. Upon learning of the attempt on his wife's life, Michael rushed to the hospital and has not left her room since. Officers spoke with Sheila, and she stated that there was no romantic relationship between them and she had nothing to do with the crime. The woman added that she was at work at the time. Detectives also interviewed Sheila's husband, who said he was aware of rumors of an affair between his wife and Michael, but could not confirm whether or not it was true. The man added that his wife had moved out about a month ago, and in fact, they were no longer together. Although the police had no evidence to link Michael and Sheila to the crime, they continued to consider their involvement highly probable. Given that the husband could not have physically been outside his house that morning, the police wondered, could Sheila have been the clown? Because of the costume, none of the witnesses could determine the gender of the assailant for certain, and Sheila was known among her colleagues for her character. The woman was responsible for dealing with clients who were delinquent in their rent payments. In most of these cases, she had to take the car away from them, and in this, Sheila was adamant. Some of these cases led to serious conflicts, so the woman always carried a gun with her. After doctors removed the bullet from Marlene's head, experts determined that it had been fired from a .38 caliber handgun, remarkably the same caliber as Sheila's. The cops went to her again to examine the weapon, but the woman said the gun had been stolen or lost months before the incident, and the detectives were again left with nothing. The cops continued to dig deeper and learned that after Sheila moved out of her husband's house, she had moved into a rental apartment, and investigators also heard rumors that Michael was paying for the place. Here, a new interesting discovery awaited the police officers. All the while, their colleagues were trying to establish where the perpetrator took the clown costume, balloons, and flowers. At first glance, it seemed a very difficult task, but the detectives were lucky they found that on May 24th, 2 days before the attempt on Marlene's life, a woman came to the costume store near Sheila's apartment. The employee said that at the time, the store was closed and they were about to leave, but the woman persistently knocked on the door until someone opened it for her. She stated that she urgently needed a clown costume, a wig, face makeup, and a red nose. The clerks tried to explain to her that the store was already closed and asked her to come back tomorrow, but the woman was adamant, so the staff still sold her the items. There were no surveillance cameras in the store, so the police officers had to rely on verbal description of the woman's appearance. The salespeople told them that she was tall and thin with dark hair. Detectives showed them pictures of several women, and the officer said the customer looked like one of them, Sheila. As for the balloons and flowers, they were traced to a supermarket about a mile from Sheila's apartment. The salesman stated that the same items had been bought by a woman just a few hours before the attempt on Marlene's life. He described her exactly like the costume store employees, a tall, thin young woman with long dark hair. The salesman added another interesting fact. According to him, the female customer exhibited rude and to some extent even masculine manners. By that time, the investigation had lasted 2 days, and on May 28th, the doctors told the police that Marlene had died. Despite their best efforts, the effects of the point-blank shot were too severe. As a result, the case was reclassified as a homicide, and detectives continued to look for more possible evidence against Sheila. They asked the judge for a warrant to search her apartment. While the police were waiting, something else happened. They were informed of a similar car in a parking lot located 13 kilometers from the victim's home. Investigators got there and quickly verified that it was the same Chrysler the killer was driving. Inside, they found some long dark hair and orange fibers that looked like pieces of a clown wig. During a search of Sheila's apartment, the police found the exact same orange-colored particles, and they also found work boots that matched the witness's description, a similar model worn by the clown on the day of the murder. Despite all this, the police had one major problem. DNA analysis was barely used at the time, and without it, all this evidence was circumstantial. A high probability the court would have acquitted Sheila, in which case it would be impossible to charge her again with murder. Then the detectives wondered, where did the car the clown drove to Marlene's house come from? And then they found out something very interesting. An employee of Michael's company told them that 1.5 months before Marlene's murder, they had received a call from a man to rent a rental car. But there was one problem. This man had mixed up the phone numbers and he had taken the car from another company, the main competitors of Michael. When the employee told the boss about it, Michael behaved very strangely. Instead of telling the customer about his mistake, he told the man to just bring the car to the parking lot and leave the keys in the cabin. Then Michael asked the employee to bring him and Sheila to the parking lot and never to tell anyone about what had happened. The employee watched as they got into that car and drove away. It was the same white Chrysler. Notably, not long before that, there had been a serious disagreement between Michael and his competitors. The problem was that Michael was portraying his competitors in a bad light in his advertising, and they didn't like their brand being portrayed in a negative light. Detectives decided to look into Michael's business in more detail. During the audit, they found numerous violations of the law, including tax and insurance manipulation. Moreover, they found evidence that Michael sometimes resorted to illegal methods of returning cars, even when customers paid on time and did not violate any terms. During this audit, the police also spoke to an employee who recalled something interesting. According to him, Michael and Marlene once had an argument in the workplace. When the woman left, Michael asked the employee, "How much would you charge to make my wife disappear?" Although it all sounded highly suspicious, detectives still had no evidence linking Michael to the murder. He was nevertheless arrested for various business manipulations. The court initially sentenced the man to 8 years in prison, but he was released after 4 years. Later, in 2002, Michael married Sheila and they moved to another state. Even though the detectives were never able to prove their involvement in the murder, they continued to watch them. The cops discovered that after the move, Sheila began introducing herself to everyone she knew under a different name, Debbie, and that she had dyed her hair from dark to blonde. She and Michael opened their restaurant, and it seemed that they had managed to build a wonderful life in the new place. However, soon rumors began to circulate among the employees of their establishment that Sheila had murdered Michael's ex-wife. Apparently, one of them stumbled across information about this crime and learned that the police still suspected them. However, detectives still could not prove their guilt, and the case finally froze. It wasn't reopened until 2013, and a new team of investigators requested a re-examination of all available evidence. By then, technology in the examination of DNA and other physical evidence had advanced to a new level compared to 1990. It took several years to examine the evidence. First, experts compared the orange flecks found in Sheila's apartment, the car, and the murder scene, and analysis showed they were identical. But the biggest clue was waiting ahead. Experts took a DNA sample from several hairs found in the white Chrysler and compared them to Sheila's DNA. They were a perfect match. Detectives thus obtained incontrovertible evidence that Sheila was in the very car in which the clown drove up to Marlene's house, enough to take the case to court. And the woman was arrested in 2017. At the time, Sheila was 54 and still denied guilt. She was denied the right to bail and awaited trial in a cell. As for Michael, he insisted that he had nothing to do with Marlene's murder and believed that Sheila had nothing to do with it either. He hired expensive attorneys for her, and the wait for the trial stretched on for years. In preparation for it, the police uncovered some facts not previously known. It turned out that a year after the murder, they were approached by a lawyer who had worked with Michael on his business. He said that about a year before the murder, Michael had asked him an extremely odd question. If the husband kills his wife, what happens to the property recorded in her name? Will the husband get it? The lawyer was surprised by such a question, but that didn't stop him from actually giving Michael advice. He said that if the husband asked his acquaintance to commit this murder and the court could not tie the husband to the man, he would get all his wife's property. But the lawyer went on to say something that later shocked investigators. He told Michael that if the killer wore some sort of costume, such as a clown, he would never be identified and would escape punishment. Another shocking confession came from a man whose father worked for Michael at the time of the murder. He confessed that his now deceased father had helped to run illegal schemes at extra cost, such as swiping mileage meters to sell cars at a higher price. But on the day of the murder, Michael asked him to do something far more terrible. He told the man to get rid of the gun and of the car. Apparently, the car in question was the one in which the killer moved after he abandoned the Chrysler in the parking lot, and the employee complied with these requests. Before he died, he told all this to his son and added another important detail. The man said that the second car was hidden in the river canal. As soon as the police received this information from his son, they combed the canal and indeed found the car there. Unfortunately, no evidence of it survived, but the very fact that it was there confirmed that the witness was telling the truth. The beginning of Sheila's trial was repeatedly postponed until finally a final date was set for May 12, 2023. But on April 25th, something unexpected happened. The woman pleaded guilty in exchange for not receiving the death penalty, which she would face if she were to lose her murder trial. Her attorneys explained the situation as follows. Sheila is innocent of the murder, but she fears for her life, which is why she took responsibility for someone else's crime. However, there is a much more logical explanation. Under the terms of the deal, she pleaded guilty to murder in the second degree, which implies a sentence of 12 years in prison, which is exactly the sentence she received. But furthermore interesting, the court deducted from that term the time the woman spent behind bars since her arrest, about 5.5 years. But that is not all. The judge reduced the remaining term due to the good behavior of Sheila. As a result, the woman was to spend between 16 and 24 months in prison. Her attorneys assured her that they could secure her release after the minimum bar of that time expired. So, Sheila was found guilty of murdering a woman in cold blood in front of her son and received a frankly ludicrous sentence for it. As for Michael, his involvement is still unproven and he remains free. Most likely he will never be charged again for the murder of his wife because there is not a single piece of evidence against him. Despite all this, the son of Marlene thanked the detectives who were able to get to the truth and did not give up on the case for many years. The death of his mother was the strongest tragedy for him because she was his only relative. Nevertheless, he was able to cope with the pain, opened his own small construction firm, and got his life together. Leslie McRae was born on April 14, 1968, in Jacksonville, Florida. She was kind-hearted, determined, outgoing, loved to have fun, had a sharp mind, and a great sense of humor. Leslie grew up in a loving family, but was particularly close to her 4-year younger cousin Joey. Despite living in different cities, the girls tried to spend as much time together as possible. Leslie even considered moving to her city when she turned 18. After graduating from high school at the age of 17, Leslie enrolled at the University of North Florida, dreaming of building a career in the modeling industry. She moved out of her parents' house and into an apartment complex with her 21-year-old boyfriend, Edgar McQuarrie. On the night of December 24, 1985, they were sleeping in their apartment when Edgar woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise. To his horror, he saw a man with a knife above their bed. The unknown criminal tied Edgar's hands and feet with ties, threatening him with a weapon to prevent him from resisting. He then tied up Leslie in the same way and took her out through the back door of the apartment. Edgar, still tied up, could only watch in horror as the kidnapper took Leslie away. It took him 3 hours to free his hands, and around 6 a.m., he called the police. Detectives arrived at their apartment, took Edgar's statement, and began searching for Leslie. Considering that the room was almost pitch black at the time of the abduction, Edgar could not see the perpetrator's face or any other distinguishing features except for brown hair. The police also did not know what kind of vehicle the kidnapper had used, although it was evident that he had used some form of transportation to abduct Leslie. While detectives were trying to find witnesses and examining the street, they received a call at their station. 3 hours after the kidnapping, a man went out for a morning run and noticed a female body lying in a ditch next to the road, 8 kilometers away from Leslie's apartment. The investigators arrived at the scene and immediately identified the young woman. Her body was covered in various injuries. Some of her clothing was torn or missing. Medical experts determined that the young woman had received more than 20 sharp object wounds, and there were also many bruises on her body. In addition, the killer had subjected the victim to violence, and experts were able to extract his biological material. Considering that DNA analysis was not yet used in those years, this evidence could not help the police identify a suspect. There were no other useful clues at the scene, so the investigators decided to focus on examining the victim's apartment. Soon, they had serious doubts about what had happened that night. According to the victim's boyfriend, the criminal had quietly entered the apartment, but no signs of a break-in were found, and there were no signs of a struggle in the rooms. In addition, the back door through which Leslie was allegedly taken out was covered in cobwebs and no fingerprints were found on it. There were no shoe prints despite a thick layer of dust around it. All of this suggested that the boyfriend's story may have been fabricated, and in that case, an obvious question arose. Does he have anything to do with the murder? However, this version had its nuances. The investigators doubted that the boyfriend could have taken out and killed his girlfriend, then returned to the apartment and called the police. Experts suggested that her body was dumped on the street after Edgar called 911, so he was no longer considered a suspect. Over the next few months, the detectives tried to find new leads, but each time they hit a dead end. As a result, the investigation was finally suspended in 1986. The criminal's biological material, which was the only serious evidence in this case, could not help the investigators at that time, and they hoped that in the future, this clue would lead them to the killer. For many years, this case sat gathering dust in archives, but Leslie's relatives never lost hope of finding the culprit. They reached out to various authorities and gathered information themselves that could be useful in solving the case. However, their resources were limited, so they were unable to find any new leads. In 2010, Leslie's mother, Sarah Adams, was diagnosed with a serious nervous system disease that practically robbed her of her ability to speak. Despite this, she continued to maintain contact with investigators through notes. After that, Leslie's cousin Joey became the most active in the search for the truth. Although she and her family lived 2 hours away from Jacksonville, she regularly traveled there to speak with investigators or help Leslie's mother. However, attempts to reach out to the police practically led nowhere. Detectives were not eager to reopen the investigation, considering the lack of new evidence. Additionally, they were occupied with ongoing criminal cases, so they were in no rush to take on a decades-old murder case. As a result, Joey began to accuse the detectives of being negligent in the early stages of the investigation, or even covering up the perpetrator. She even suggested that the killer may have bribed investigators, but she had no evidence to support this theory. Joey also regularly gave interviews to local news channels, trying to draw public attention to the case. She recalled the time spent with her older sister and described Leslie as a cheerful and positive person. She also regretted that her 2 children never got to know what a wonderful aunt Leslie could have been to them. In late 2018, her relatives' persistent efforts produced the first results. They contacted representatives of the Cold Case Files project, and they became interested in Leslie's case. This nonprofit organization, which began in 2015, focuses on unsolved murders in which police have been unable to find the perpetrators. The organization collects and disseminates information, engages in dialogue with investigators and the media. In addition, they provide support to the victims' relatives, advising them on communication with the police and journalists. The organization's employees posted information about Leslie's murder on various resources, trying to attract as much attention as possible to the case. In such cases, when investigators have not been able to solve the case, public interest can play a key role. Firstly, the more people hear about this crime, the more chances there are that potential witnesses to the event will be among them. Sometimes people, without realizing it, may have seen or heard something that could lead the police to the killer. Secondly, under pressure from the public and the media, the chances of detectives reopening the investigation increased. Throughout this time, they have the perpetrator's biological material, but to study it, they needed to reopen the case, which police officers often do not do due to a lack of personnel or funding. The organization worked together with Leslie's relatives for several months, and they really managed to draw attention to this case. They wrote in the news and talked about it in reports, and in June 2019, representatives of a popular local TV channel contacted the family. They offered to record a large-scale interview in which relatives could talk about Leslie and their years-long attempts to seek the truth. Her cousin and mother accepted the offer and met with journalists. They told them about who Leslie was as a person, showed her photos, and were dismayed by the fact that the police had not been investigating the case for over 30 years. In addition, in the interview, relatives mentioned that they believed that the boys Leslie mentioned were her killers, and in their opinion, her story about a man with a knife was not trustworthy. The boy himself could have killed her, but the journalists decided to cut this moment out, as Edgar was not a suspect in this case and there was no evidence against him. Representatives of the TV channel contacted the sheriff's office, hoping to get some additional information, but the police refused to comment. They referred to rules that prohibited them from discussing with journalists cases that were not currently under investigation. Leslie's family was disappointed with this outcome, But they were not going to give up. Joey continued to write letters to investigators demanding that the case be reopened, and ultimately it paid off. The family was able to organize a meeting with law enforcement representatives, and detectives indicated their intention to revive the investigation. The Leslie family was interviewing again, and the police began to re-examine the evidence. In April 2020, they sent biological material from the victim's body to a laboratory, and soon experts extracted a DNA profile, which was entered into the FBI's national database and immediately received a match. Almost 35 years later, the investigators finally had a possible killer's name. He was 58-year-old David Nelson Austin. After studying his biography, the detectives found many interesting moments. His DNA was in the FBI database not just by chance. Since 1991, the man had been serving a sentence for 2 sexual crimes committed in 1988 and 1990. At that time, he lived in Michigan, where he moved from Florida. Detectives determined that at the time of Leslie's death, he was living in Jacksonville and was 24 years old. 2 months before the murder, he attacked a mentally disabled young woman and attempted to assault her, but he failed. The man was arrested, but the justice system treated his act very lightly. Austin received no serious punishment and remained free. In addition to this, he had a whole series of less serious crimes, including drug possession, disturbing the peace, and more. Detectives had no doubt that he was behind Leslie's murder and began preparing the case for trial. Gathering all the necessary materials, in early 2021, they went to the Michigan prison to interrogate Austin for the first time. The man denied his involvement, but no one was going to believe him on his word. Investigators took his DNA sample to directly compare it with the biological material found on the victim's body. This had to be done as part of the standard procedure, and the result was expected: a complete match. In August 2021, Austin was officially charged with the murder of Leslie. Since then, detectives have been working to have him transferred from Michigan to Florida, where the crime was committed. The need for transfer was due to one simple fact: Florida had the death penalty, unlike Michigan, and Austin could have received that sentence for the murder of Leslie. The process took a year, until September 2022, when he was finally transferred to a correctional facility in Florida. He is currently behind bars, awaiting trial, and investigators have no doubt about his guilt. The only way for the perpetrator to avoid the death penalty is to make a deal with the prosecution and confess to the murder in exchange for another life sentence. During a press conference, investigators admitted that Austin was never a suspect in the case and was never questioned. According to them, the man did not leave any clues that the police could use to pursue him, and DNA analysis was impossible at that time. Furthermore, his DNA was only added to the FBI database in 1991, 6 years after the murder. Joey also gave an interview in which she said that she had always believed that Leslie's boyfriend was the killer. It was only after investigators revealed the real perpetrator's name that she realized that Edgar was also a victim in this story. It is expected that she will be the main witness in the trial. Leslie's mother said she forgave her daughter's killer, which surprised her family members, but they all respected her decision. Interestingly, Austin has a son named Owen, whom he has never met. Nevertheless, they regularly communicated via email. Journalists contacted Owen and learned that he was shocked by the charges against his father. Austin himself wrote to him about it, adding that he had nothing to do with this crime. At the same time, his son was well aware of other criminal episodes from his father's life, but continued to communicate with him. Austin's trial is expected to begin soon. If there are no bureaucratic delays, he may receive his sentence in a few months. Despite the fact that the truth has finally come out, the victim's relatives still blame investigators for negligence, believing that if they had periodically reopened this case, the perpetrator's identity could have been established in the early 90s rather than 30 years later. On January 2, 1999, in the American city of Mesa, Arizona, two sisters, 11-year-old Michaela and 9-year-old Kimber, were walking close to home. It was a chilly evening and was just beginning to get dark outside. Despite the height of winter, Arizona is a warm southern state. So Michaela brought her bike and rode alongside her sister. At one point, the girls thought they heard the sound of an approaching ice cream truck. They put speakers on them and turned on music to alert children to the approach of a favorite treat. The girl hurried home to ask her mother and change for ice cream, then returned to the street. However, the ice cream truck was nowhere to be found, and the girls began to wait. At some point, Kimber got cold. She told her sister that she would run inside to get a jacket and come back. When she arrived back, Michaela was no longer there. The bike was lying on the road with its wheels still spinning. Beside it lay the 2 coins the girl had prepared to buy ice cream. Kimber came home and told her mother that Michaela was missing. Neither she nor her mother had yet allowed even the thought that anything could have happened to the girl. The mother thought that Michaela had gone to a neighbor with whom the family was friendly, but the girl was not there, and the mother realized that something terrible might have happened to her daughter. Immediately thereafter, she went to the police. It is worth noting that the police response was very fast. Already, in 30 minutes, a helicopter was in the air. The law enforcers stopped all suspicious cars, bypassed the surrounding houses. That day, volunteers from the girls' school handed out and posted flyers with her picture. Those pictures would later appear in storefronts and on billboards along roads throughout Arizona. Police searched dumpsters and inspected hundreds of homes. Detective Butch Gates and Jerry Giselle were assigned to the case. The cops questioned every ice cream vendor in the state and could not establish that at least one of them was in that area at the time of the girl's disappearance. Detectives reconstructed the chronology of events and came to an eerie conclusion. The girl disappeared in just 90 seconds. That's how long Kimber had been missing. The spinning wheel on the bicycle confirmed the fact that the abduction had taken place extremely quickly. Search dogs, the help of which was used by the investigation, could not get a trace of the girl, and when they did, they took only a few steps in the direction of the road. The fact that the dog takes the mark of the person only when the missing person left on his feet, this only reinforced the main version of the police. The girl was put in a car, taken away, and it all happened in a matter of seconds. The situation was complicated by the complete lack of witnesses. Despite the fact that the girls were playing in a street filled with houses, none of the neighbors saw them that night. Later, there was information that a man tried to kidnap the 2 girls right out of school. The children were 10 and 11 years old at the time. Police checked the information for a connection to the disappearance of Michaela, who was just 11, but the kidnapping turned out to be a failed prank. There was less and less evidence, so police began working out the standard theories. When a child goes missing, parents and other relatives are always checked. Given that Michaela's mother was at home at the time of the kidnapping, investigators took on the girl's father, Darian Biggs. From the beginning, no one really believed in his involvement. Why would a father kidnap his own daughter, especially in such a way, in the middle of the street, in a short period of time when his other daughter was running home? However, it soon became clear that the man had lied about his alibi. During the first interrogation, he stated that he was at work at the time of the abduction, which turned out to be untrue. In reality, he was spending time with his mistress. What happened next was even more interesting. The man failed the polygraph questioning. His wife admitted that she knew about the cheating. Darian himself had told her about it a month before it happened. The couple thought about divorce. Despite the fake alibi, the police eventually stopped considering the father as a suspect. Even in the event of a divorce, his wife had no plans to forbid him from seeing his children. He simply had no motive. In addition, the detectives acknowledged that the lie detector results may have been influenced by the emotional state of the father, whose daughter had just been abducted. He may even have laid some of the blame on himself and thought that if he had been home with his family, the tragedy could have been avoided. Detectives also tracked Therian's movements that evening and determined that he simply would not have had time to hide Michaela. The man showed up at home very quickly after his spouse called him to report his daughter missing. Detective Giselle later stated that Michaela most likely did not know her abductor. If it had been the father, she would not have thrown the bicycle and change on the ground. The girl tried to run away from the stranger, but simply did not make it. During the investigation, police regularly had leads that led nowhere. An anonymous man called detectives and reported that Michaela's body was in an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. Police combed the area but found nothing. Later, they received an email from an anonymous man claiming that he was the one who had kidnapped the girl. The FBI fairly quickly traced the sender's IP address and sent a SWAT team to his home in the city of Phoenix. It turned out that the sender was a 12-year-old boy who had just decided to make a joke. Meanwhile, the police had reached a stalemate, beginning to process even the most incomprehensible theories. They combed through 35 abandoned gold mines in the county, and then even questioned nearly 500 psychics who could supposedly help the investigation. Of course, this went nowhere. One witness was found who had seen a mint-colored Jeep shortly before Michaela was kidnapped. The driver was quickly found and proved innocent. After that, the police were already desperate to find the girl because there was literally not a single clue left in front of them. This went on until September 27, 1999, when the quiet county was not shocked by another shocking event. A woman living near Biggs returned home and walked into the kitchen to find a middle-aged man with his pants unbuttoned. Without uttering a word, he jumped on the woman and began strangling and abusing her. The perpetrator then set fire to the house and left. Apparently, the attacker thought his victim was dead, but the woman survived. Her neck was broken, but she was able to reach the phone and call an ambulance. Already on her way to the hospital, she whispered to the doctors from her last breath, "Michaela Biggs, the girl who is missing. He took her. You must save her." The whole town was on its ears again. Events swirled rapidly. The police took up the case and arrested the assailant. He turned out to be D. Bullock. The man was a well-known alcoholic in the area who lived with his wife and 3 children, repaired wrecked cars, and occasionally disrupted public order. His house was only 2 blocks from Biggs. D. was one of the first to volunteer to help find Michaela and willingly let police into the house to search, but not into the trailer in the backyard. For the trailer, he demanded a warrant. Agree, this behavior is extremely bizarre. A man with a bad reputation volunteering to help find a missing girl, giving the police a look around his house without any questions, and suddenly forbidding them to look in the trailer. From then on, Bullock became the prime suspect. Even though his wife provided him with an alibi for the time Michaela was kidnapped, no one believed her story, and most likely, she was just afraid of her husband. Detectives began digging into Bullock's past and discovered that he had been tried 3 times for violence and molestation, as well as for kidnapping minors. He didn't get out of prison until 1995, and at that time, none of the neighbors had any idea what kind of monster lived next door. Several times a week, Michaela took private piano lessons from a neighbor who lived across the street from Bullock's house. This suggested that the man may have known the girl long before she disappeared. After Bullock was arrested for assaulting the woman, the police searched his house again and planned to investigate the trailer he had kept them out of earlier, but they were disappointed. The trailer had disappeared without a trace. This was a major blow to Michaela's parents. They were sure their daughter was there, alive or not, but he had disappeared and the police were unable to trace his location. Bullock was sentenced to 15.5 years in prison for the September 27, 1999 attack on the woman. He categorically denied any involvement in Michaela's disappearance. This is not surprising. For the attack on his neighbor and the atrocities he did to her, 15 years in prison would be a lenient sentence by U.S. standards. A confession to kidnapping an 11-year-old girl, on the other hand, could have landed him straight in the electric chair. The parents could not accept that their only hope for the truth was gone. The mother and father wrote Bullock a letter directly to the prison, asking the ultimate question, whether he had anything to do with Michaela's disappearance. No one hoped to get a confession, but the criminal's answer took the parents by surprise. He wrote that the conversation was too personal and suggested that her parents visit him in prison. At that moment, hope rekindled in the hearts of the parents that Bullock would confess, but they were greatly disappointed. Sitting across from the perpetrator, the father asked if he had anything to do with his daughter's disappearance. Bullock simply replied that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. The conversation continued in this vein for several more minutes, after which the perpetrator simply picked up and left, accompanied by security. It looked as if he was just teasing the parents, giving them false hope and destroying it by looking them in the eye. For a sadist like Bullock, the suffering of others can bring unsurpassed pleasure. This is apparently why he arranged the meeting with the grief-stricken parents. Afterwards, Michaela's father confessed that he was convinced that Bullock was involved. He stated, "I was sitting a few feet away from the guy who killed my daughter, and there was nothing I could do about it." At this point, even the most staunch hopes of solving the case were abandoned. Absolutely everyone believed that no new leads would ever emerge. Years later, they would realize that they were wrong, but more on that later. On the 5th anniversary of Michaela's disappearance, the parents buried an empty coffin, finally saying goodbye to their daughter. During this time, their marriage broke up. They changed their residence and were reluctant to contact journalists. Until 2018, the case went into a long drawer. The police simply had nothing to work with. But out of the blue, an event occurred that stirred up all of America. On March 14, 2018, a dollar bill was accidentally dropped at a police station in Neenah, Wisconsin. On it was written in stubby handwriting, "My name is Michaela Biggs, kidnapped from Mass. I am alive." The bill was found by a local resident who was collecting coins and dollar bills in a jar. He was the one who came across the dollar, after which he reported the find to the police, and they instantly reopened the investigation. Michaela's mother rushed nearly 2,000 miles away to look at the handwriting and see if the message was actually written by her daughter. Other relatives also came to the station, but they all made a disappointing statement. The handwriting looked nothing like Michaela's, and the name was misspelled. The mother suggested that the bill might be someone's extremely unfortunate prank. The other relatives also supported this theory. Despite this, the police attempted to trace the bill's path. Alas, it was almost impossible to do so. Paper money changes owners so many times that it was impossible to find the author of this inscription. Experts who studied the bill suggested that the inscription was made by an adult man who was trying to imitate the handwriting of a child. Despite all this, the message on the paper bill seems highly suspicious. Could it have been someone's prank? The chance of police and relatives finding out about the bill are extremely slim. It could have been passed around for years, or it could have settled in a bank vault and no one would have noticed it. The fact that it ended up in the hands of a concerned person who reported it to the police is more of a miracle than inevitability. As for the handwriting, the most obvious version cannot be ruled out. Michaela may have written in a hurry for fear of being caught. Besides, she had been missing for 9 years before the bill appeared. Assuming someone held her captive, did they give her something to write all that time? In 9 years without practice, handwriting can change beyond recognition. There is another question no one knows the answer to. How long ago this writing was made? The bill could have been in circulation for years, or it could have appeared shortly before it was discovered. It's worth remembering about Bullock, who was supposed to be released from prison in 2017. Perhaps this evil prank is his doing. Suffice it to recall how he tormented unhappy parents by giving them false hope. Perhaps we will never know the answer to all these questions again, or this case will once again shake the world with unexpected details. Kimber, who was the last person to see her older sister before she was kidnapped, still can't forget that gruesome January night. For a long time, she blamed herself for going home to get her jacket, but now she realizes against an adult kidnapper, she would have been helpless. Kimber raises her young son, to whom she constantly talks about his Aunt Michaela. She calls her an angel who looks out for him. The girl, as well as the rest of her family, are sure that Michaela was kidnapped by Bullock, but without evidence, it can never be proved unless the criminal himself decides to confess in order to deal another blow to the missing girl's family. Do you think there's any hope that the writing on the bill was done by Michaela herself and she is still alive? Lindy Sue Beekler was born on January 31, 1956, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. When she was young, her parents divorced and she stayed with her mother. Her father started a new family but continued to see his daughter regularly. Soon, he had a son with whom Lindy was in constant communication. After school, she enrolled at Millersville University, a state college located just 10 minutes from home. At the age of 19, Lindy met a man named Philip Beekler, and the couple soon married. He also attended courses at the college while working for a car rental company. Lindy herself worked part-time at a local flower shop. After the wedding, they rented an apartment in the Manor Township residential complex just a few minutes from the college. The newlyweds began their life together and were happy with each other. However, almost immediately after moving in, Lindy's happiness was overshadowed by a series of unpleasant events. She began to notice that someone was constantly watching her in this residential complex, but she never managed to see who it could be. The young woman often complained to friends and relatives, but they attributed what was happening to stress after the move. One evening, when Lindy was home alone, she noticed the man looking at her through the glass door inserts. The apartment was on the first floor and her husband was at work at the time. The man immediately disappeared, leaving Lindy terrified. Since then, the young woman was afraid to be alone at home, but due to Philip's evening schedule, she often had to be alone until it was dark. Lindy was constantly stressed and any incident could bring her to panic. Soon after this event, she spent time with her brother and his family at their home when they heard the sound of breaking glass from the second floor. It turned out that a wall mirror had fallen to the floor and shattered. The young woman was so scared that she started shaking. She asked her relatives to go around the whole house and make sure that no one else had broken in. All this stress was the result of the fact that some unknown man had been watching her for several months. But all of her acquaintances still believed that the young woman was overreacting and that nothing serious was happening to her. On December 5, 1975, Lindy finished her shift at a flower shop and stopped by her husband's workplace before heading to a local store to do some shopping. Around the same time, her aunt and uncle went to their son's basketball game and decided to invite Lindy along as they knew she was afraid to be alone at home and wanted to distract her for a few hours. They arrived at her apartment at around 8:45 p.m. Lindy's aunt approached the door and found it open, which immediately alarmed her. She went inside and saw a knocked-over lamp in the living room, but the worst was waiting for her in the kitchen. Lindy's body lay there. She was laying face down with no signs of life, and a meat cleaver with a towel wrapped around its handle was found in her neck. Lindy's aunt immediately called the police, and detectives began investigating the crime scene. The first thing they noticed was that Lindy was fully dressed, which cast doubt on the motive being related to rape. Additionally, no valuables were missing from the apartment, ruling out robbery as a possibility. There were no signs of forced entry on the front door or windows, suggesting that Lindy either knew her attacker and let them in voluntarily, or the attacker entered the apartment when the door was left unlocked. The fact that Lindy had purchased a lot of groceries and physically couldn't have carried all the bags from the parking lot to her apartment in one go suggests that her killer may have entered the apartment just after she had taken the first load inside and gone back to her car for the second. While the police were investigating the crime scene, Lindy's husband and parents were informed of what had happened. The grieving family members were desperate to see Lindy and had to be restrained by detectives. Forensic investigators found bloodstains on the floor and walls, but DNA testing was not available at the time, so they could not compare these samples to Lindy's DNA. They did conclude that Lindy had put up a fight with her attacker. A male shoe print was found in one of the rooms, and medical experts determined that Lindy had received 19 blows from a sharp object. The perpetrator had used two weapons, the meat cleaver from Lindy's kitchen and a second weapon, presumably a knife, that was never found. Later, it was confirmed that Lindy had indeed been sexually assaulted, but DNA evidence could not be extracted from the crime scene. At the time, DNA testing was not advanced enough to be of much help in solving the case. The police had hoped to find witnesses, but none of their neighbors were home at the time of the murder. Other residents did not notice anything suspicious. However, several people reported seeing a car parked in the residential complex parking lot from around 7 p.m. to 8:40 p.m., which coincided with the time of Lindy's murder. Additionally, none of the residents knew the owner of the car. Unfortunately, the detectives were unable to locate it and switched to another line of investigation. As is often the case in such situations, the victim's husband became a suspect. Despite Philip being at work and having a solid alibi, investigators did not rule out his possible involvement. Over the next few months, detectives interviewed about 300 people who could have been involved in the murder, but all that yielded no results. At some point, they began to suspect a local serial rapist who had committed several attacks on women around the same time Lindy was killed. However, they were unable to find any evidence linking him to the case, and the culprit himself died during an attempt to escape from prison. Moreover, investigators found out that at the time of the murder, he was at work, and eventually, they stopped considering him as a suspect. 4 months after the murder, there was a new twist in the case. A 43-year-old woman named Mary was killed 25 kilometers away from Lindy's apartment. She received multiple stab wounds, and the detectives immediately noted that these murders were almost 100% similar. But soon the culprit was caught, and investigators could not find any connection between him and Lindy. The man admitted to killing Mary but denied involvement in the other crimes. After that, the police had no leads, and the case went cold for a year. On December 26, 1976, Lindy's relatives went to visit her grave at the local cemetery. Upon arriving, they saw that the gravestone was covered in red paint and heavily scratched. They immediately reported it to the police, but they were unable to find the vandals. Investigators concluded that the perpetrator of the desecration may have been Lindy's killer, as no other graves were damaged. The nature of the damage also supported this theory, as the criminal clearly harbored animosity towards the deceased, in addition to the obvious association with the red paint. By using a knife or sharp object, the perpetrator had to have spent a considerable amount of time damaging the stone in order to completely cover it with deep scratches. Just a few weeks later, something even stranger happened. Chief Donald W. Scheller, whose department was investigating Lindy's murder, received an anonymous 2-page letter. The first part was written from the perspective of the killer, who taunted the police for not being able to catch him yet. The author took responsibility for the vandalism of Lindy's grave and demanded that the letter be published in the next day's local newspapers. In exchange, the anonymous writer promised to consider surrendering to the police. He then went on to provide several characteristics to help investigators identify him, claiming to be 178 centimeters tall, weighing 93 kilograms, living in the western suburbs of Lancaster, having a good job, being single, and having been caught a few years earlier for possession of illegal substances. On the day of the murder, he was also under the influence of drugs. The last part of the letter was a plea for help, with the unknown author asking to be caught before he killed anyone else. The second page was a separate letter allegedly written by the killer's friend, named Jenny Scrum. She wrote that her acquaintance truly intended to surrender once his letter was published in the newspapers, and added that the man was mentally ill. She purportedly added this message while he was sleeping before placing both sheets in an envelope. Police believed that the author could indeed be Lindy's killer, but they did not believe the second part about his friend Jenny. Despite being written in a different handwriting, investigators believe that the perpetrator may have asked someone he knew to write it or use some other method to forge the handwriting. They also failed to notice the similarity of this message to the letter sent by a serial killer nicknamed the Zodiac Killer, who operated in California in the 60s and 70s, regularly communicating with the police and newspapers through anonymous text messages. Investigators even considered that he might have been responsible for Lindy's murder. However, this theory was highly stretched. Firstly, the killer was operating on the opposite side of the country. Secondly, by the time Lindy was killed, according to the police, the Zodiac Killer had already stopped his killings. Chief Donald W. Scheller decided not to publish the letter in the newspaper as the author requested. At that time, the police had 2 suspects and they did not want to compromise the investigation. Detectives did not believe that the culprit would surrender and saw no point in scarring residents with a letter from a madman. Eventually, they began to doubt that the author was actually Lindy's killer. The letter did not contain any details that had not already appeared in the newspapers. The police profiler even suggested that the author of both sheets could be a mentally ill woman who had no connection to the case. He made this conclusion after analyzing the writing style. Despite this, investigators located a woman named Jenny Scrum and, after talking to her, concluded that she had nothing to do with these letters. From that moment on, the police had no serious leads, but they continued to investigate the case. At various stages, they had new suspects. Lindy's mother's partner, a regular visitor to the flower shop where she worked, and even one of the investigators on the case. After brief checks, detectives came to the conclusion that none of them were involved in the murder. In 1980, the police had another chance to solve the case. In Florida, they arrested serial killer Gerald Stano, who admitted to killing 41 people. At the time of Lindy's death, his father lived just 10 minutes away from her complex, so detectives considered the possibility that Stano might have been the killer. But they could not find any evidence that the man visited his father and soon stopped considering him as a suspect. In 1997, experts were able to extract a male DNA profile, discovering traces of semen on the victim's underwear. This sample did not match any of the suspects that investigators had for 23 years. Since then, the police have not had any significant leads, and the case went cold. It was reviewed in 2000, but with no results in the same year, detectives decided to publish a letter in newspapers supposedly written by the killer, hoping it would help them get new leads, but it didn't. Lindy's parents never found out the truth about her murder. Lindy's father passed away in 2000 and her mother in 2007. The next major breakthrough only occurred in 2019 after the case was reopened again. Investigators decided to turn to a private laboratory called Parabon Nanolabs, which specializes in genetic research and has helped solve similar cases in the past. Using an innovative method called DNA phenotyping, experts were able to create an approximate portrait of Lindy's killer at the ages of 25 and 60. This method works by studying the criminal's DNA sample and finding information about possible physical traits, such as skin color, eye color, hair color, and so on. Such portraits often turn out to be very similar to real DNA holders, although there are exceptions. The killer's portraits were widely distributed through the media. Investigators hoped someone would recognize this man, but in the end, they didn't get any serious leads. A year later, they turned to Parabon Nanolabs again, this time to use the method of genetic genealogy. This is also a relatively new method that allows experts to find possible relatives of any person based on their DNA. Investigators provided them with a genetic sample from Lindy's killer and waited. The main drawback of this method is the incredible complexity of the research. Experts have to study thousands of people, eliminating unsuitable candidates until they finally find a relative of the DNA holder. After many months of hard work, they were able to find a person who was distantly related to the killer. He turned out to be a resident of Italy, and now investigators could begin to examine his family tree. They were looking for a man who was in the USA in 1975 and lived near Lancaster. To do this, they had to locate and question a huge number of relatives. In Lancaster alone, there were 2,500 people related to the killer by distant kinship. In 2022, the detectives finally found a suitable candidate, 68-year-old David Sinopoli, a man who had never come to the attention of the police in connection with the case. In 1975, he lived in the same complex as the victim, so he immediately became the main suspect. To confirm or refute his involvement, detectives needed to secretly obtain a DNA sample. To do this, they began to follow David, waiting for the right moment. On February 11th, they had such an opportunity. The man flew out to the airport in Philadelphia and, before boarding the flight, threw a paper coffee cup into a bin. The investigators took it and handed it over to the laboratory. Experts extracted his DNA sample and compared it with the semen DNA found on Lindy's underwear. The analysis showed a complete match. David was the killer. He was arrested on July 17, 2022, and is currently awaiting trial. At the time of Lindy's murder, he was 21 years old. He moved into the residential complex a year before the victim moved there with her husband. David was married twice in 1972 and 1987. According to available information, he did not have children. He spent most of his life working at a printing press in a local printing house, and his colleagues were shocked that their good acquaintance turned out to be a ruthless killer. David is now in custody, and additional details will only emerge after the start of the trial. But even now, there is virtually no doubt that he is the killer. Experts also compared his DNA to the blood found in the victim's apartment, and the analysis showed a complete match. Lindy's ex-husband and brother thanked the investigators for being able to uncover the truth, and now the guilty party will be punished. Thus, this complex and convoluted case was solved with the help of innovative technologies almost 47 years later. Genetic genealogy is a unique tool that allows the police to find perpetrators based on the tiniest DNA samples stored for half a century. Marianne Vestra was born on August 10, 1982, in the Netherlands. She lived with her parents in De Westreen, a small village in the north of the country, far from large cities. The young woman was the youngest of 6 children. She had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. Over time, almost all of the older children left for other cities and countries, and Marianne was left to live with her parents and 1 older brother. The young woman studied at the local school, was fond of music, and had many friends. The area where she lived was dotted with small towns and settlements located a few kilometers apart. For this reason, Marianne often went to other localities to spend time with friends or go shopping. In her free time, she also worked at the local supermarket as a part-time employee. On April 30, 1999, the country celebrated a big holiday, Queen's Day. Marianne finished her shift at the store and went to a nearby town called Colum to spend the evening with her friends at a local cafe. A few hours later, their company was joined by Marianne's boyfriend and his friends, and together they all decided to go to a settlement called Boykenpost, which was 6 kilometers away. The group rode there on their bicycles, but Marianne did not have one, so she borrowed a bicycle and went for a ride with her friends. After a while, they decided to go home, and the young woman headed in the direction of her town, which was about 11 kilometers away. But she never made it home. Her parents thought that Marianne had stayed the night with a friend who lived in Cullum, although this was doubtful. The young woman had promised to be home by evening, and if she had decided to spend the night at her friend's, she would certainly have called home. Early in the morning, Marianne's father called at the house of her best friend, Affie. To his surprise, he heard that his daughter had said goodbye to her friend that night and headed home. At this point, it became clear to everyone that something bad might have happened to Marianne. Her friend called her boyfriend, took her sister with her, and together they drove along the route Marianne took home. Meanwhile, the young woman's father decided to go to the police immediately. He told them that his daughter had not returned home and none of her friends knew where she was. Soon, 2 officers arrived to take a missing persons report, after which they returned to the station and prepared to begin their search. Meanwhile, Affie and her sister and boyfriend were driving near the settlement of Finkleister with vast fields on either side of the road. At one point, they noticed something shiny in the grass and stopped. As they approached the field, they saw a bicycle lying in the grass. A little further away, about 15 meters away, was the awful sight of Marianne laying there. She had no clothes on, and there was a cut on her neck. All 3 were shocked. Affie wanted to check Marianne's pulse, but could not bring herself to approach the body. It was obvious that the young woman was dead, but her best friend couldn't believe it because of the intense shock. She struggled to get her phone out and called the police. Several officers arrived on the scene at once, and 2 police officers went to Marianne's family home. At the time, they did not yet have official confirmation of the victim's identity, so the officers picked up her father and drove him to the scene. Forensic investigators were already on the scene at the time, and the father, to his grief, immediately identified Marianne. After examining the scene, the detective noticed an important detail. There were 2 bicycle tracks leading from the road to the place where the young woman's body was lying, and only 1 track in the opposite direction. That meant the killer was also on a bicycle. The police searched the surrounding area for clues and even conducted aerial photography, but the only thing they could find near the murder scene was a lighter. Marianne's friend stated that she did not smoke and did not have a lighter, so the police sent her to the lab. Medical examiners determined that the young woman had been abused and found traces of semen, from which they were able to compile a sample of the killer's DNA. The same DNA was found on the lighter. It was uploaded to the police database, but there was no matches. This meant that the perpetrator had no previous criminal record. Almost immediately after the body was found, the police chose a Marianne boyfriend named Spencer as a suspect. There was no evidence against him, but it seemed to the head of the local police department that the boy was the most likely killer in such a case. However, the young man voluntarily provided his DNA sample, and it did not match the one found on the victim's body. In the meantime, the crime had been covered extensively in the local media and on television. In that quiet and peaceful area, such murders were almost unheard of, and the public demanded that the police catch the culprit as soon as possible. The problem was that detectives were already deadlocked within the first week. They had a DNA sample of the killer, but no suspects. The police also received numerous calls from local residents. Some of them thought someone they knew might be behind the murder, but there was no confirmation of any of those theories. But the vast majority of people pointed to one specific place. Near the field where Marianne's body was found was a migration center for people who had applied for asylum. Most of the people there were from Iran and Syria. With each passing day, this theory spread through the local towns, and at one point, an impressive number of people were 100% certain that a refugee had committed the murder. Because of this, the police had to investigate this possibility. On May 5th, Marianne's funeral was held. Almost 1,500 people came to support her family at that moment, many from neighboring communities. 2 days later, the woman's parents organized a memorial procession, at the end of which they addressed the public. A total of about 20,000 people took part in the event, mostly due to the active national coverage of the case. More and more people contacted the police each day, and at one point the detectives got a really interesting lead. Several people reported seeing Marianne at a cafe one night as a certain Oriental-looking guy approached her and tried to get to know her. After the young woman refused, the guy made a gesture toward her with his thumb along her throat. Given that the young woman was killed in this manner, the police immediately began searching for the young man. He turned out to be a 15-year-old refugee from the same migration center. He admitted that he had indeed made such a gesture, but denied any involvement in the murder. The boy gave a DNA sample, and it did not match the one found on the victim's body. Despite this, local residents continued to blame the refugees from the migration center. The organization even had to hire additional security guards in case of possible conflicts. 12 days after the murder, people came out to the migration center to protest. At first, they simply shouted out demands to give them the murderer, but by evening the situation had escalated greatly. Several people threw Molotov cocktails in the direction of the building, forcing the police to intervene. Since then, security at the center has been significantly stepped up, and there have been no more demonstrations of this kind. A few days later, the police announced the arrest of a 32-year-old man named Pitt, who lived in the same town as Marianne. He was a local alcoholic and was disliked by most of the residents. The arrest came after a witness contacted the police that he had seen Pitt in bloody clothes the night of the murder. The man was detained and his DNA sample was sent to the lab. Almost instantly, journalists spread the word nationwide about the new suspect, except the DNA didn't match the sample, and the witness admitted to making up the whole story in retaliation against Pitt for a personal grudge. Investigating a possible connection to the immigration center, police began examining the logbook, which records all movements of refugees from the asylum area. They had the right to leave the center, but to do so, they had to check the log and indicate where they were going and why. It turned out that 2 refugees had left the center on the night of the murder, but had not indicated where they were going. They were 26-year-old Ali and 19-year-old Mohammed. Police began looking into their possible involvement, but no details were released for a long time. Marianne's father was unhappy that investigators were keeping his family in the dark and still hadn't found the killer. He contacted a well-known crime reporter who agreed to take over the case and tried to find more information. On July 1st, the father of the victim appeared on a popular television program where he voiced the facts discovered by the journalist. First, the 2 refugees who left the center on the night of the murder were in the same cafe as Marianne. They also left almost immediately after the young woman left with her friends. Second, since that very night, the whereabouts of these men have been unknown. They had not returned to the center and the police could not find them. At the same time, they had photographs of both men, but for some reason, the authorities did not publish them. After all these facts were made public on television, the police stated that they were currently searching for these suspects together with Interpol. The main theory is that they may have fled the country. All this has again aggravated relations between local residents and refugees. In early October, they again gathered outside the center to protest. On October 9th, Turkish police reported the arrest of one of the suspects, 26-year-old Ali. It turned out that all this time he had been living in Istanbul. He was taken to the Netherlands, where a DNA sample was taken and the necessary tests conducted. It did not match the sample found on the victim's body, and the man was cleared of suspicion. The investigation has since stalled again, and at some point, the police and Marianne's family began to suspect her boyfriend again. Even though his DNA did not match the sample, Spencer's behavior seemed suspicious. The young woman's acquaintances and relatives were certain that Marianne would never ride her bike home at night because she was afraid of the dark, and the distance was not that short. Spencer should have sent her home by cab, which even Marianne's parents knew. Instead, he let her go alone on her bicycle. The young man was questioned several more times, and here began something strange. He changed his testimony about that evening several times. Originally, Spencer said that he had met Marianne at a cafe, after which they drove to the Butin Post. On re-examination, however, he stated that the young woman had gone there with friends before he even got to the cafe, so Spencer went to her on his bicycle. He went on to say that on the way there, he saw two guys walking with a bicycle. At one interrogation, Spencer said he did not recognize them because it was very dark outside. Then, he said they were two of his friends. This all seems strange, but the police had no evidence against Spencer, and his DNA did not match the killer's sample. The case stalled for several more months. On December 20th, the police decided to enlist the help of the public and asked all the men in the area to volunteer their DNA samples. But there was trouble waiting for them. It turned out that the law forbade the mass collection of DNA from citizens, even with their consent. So the authorities set a limit for the police. They could only take 150 samples, among which there was not a single match. From that point on, the case practically came to a standstill for several years. Marianne's parents tried to push for a change in the law that would have allowed extensive DNA screening, but they were turned down. The rationale was to protect people's privacy, even though such measures had already led to the capture of the perpetrator several times in other countries. In July 2001, the detectives announced an approximate profile of the perpetrator. They believed the killer was a local man between the ages of 20 and 40. The police again requested permission to conduct a large-scale collection of DNA samples within a 5-kilometer radius of the Marianne murder scene, but they were again denied. After that, the case finally came to a standstill. The victims' parents continued to participate in television shows and gave interviews, but each year, the case attracted less and less attention. There was no new evidence to help solve the gruesome mystery. In 2010, the police assembled a team that created a detailed 3D model of the crime scene and all available evidence using the latest computer technology. This again drew widespread public attention, and Marianne's parents again talked about the need for DNA screening. This time, 11 years after their daughter's murder, authorities decided to finally consider changing the law. The process took almost 2 years, and on September 6, 2012, the necessary amendments were passed. Police called a press conference to ask all men who were between 20 and 40 years old in 1999 to submit their DNA samples. The collection area was also limited to 5 kilometers. They estimated they were talking about 8,000 men, but not all of them agreed to give their DNA. The police managed to collect just over 6,500 samples, and experts began to study them. Unfortunately, the resources of the lab were limited. They had time to check about 400 samples a week, so the study had to take up to 4 months. The experts compared the samples to the killer's DNA profile, but they weren't just looking for a complete match. After all, it was unlikely the perpetrator would have given his DNA to the police. The lab was also trying to figure out the similarities by which they could establish kinship and trace back to the killer through a father, brother, or other relative. On November 19th, a month after the test began, experts finally got a long-awaited match. What was surprising was that they didn't just find a familial link, they got the DNA of the killer himself, meaning he voluntarily provided it to the police. Detectives soon announced the arrest of 45-year-old Jasper Syringa, a local farmer and father of 2. His house was only a few kilometers from where Marianne was killed. At first, the man kept silent, but after a conversation with his lawyer, he decided to confess. But the public only learned the details of this terrible crime on March 28, 2013, when the trial began. According to Jasper, that late evening, he was finishing up chores on his farm and decided to ride his bicycle before going to bed. As he himself admitted most of the time, riding his bicycle was just a cover for him. In fact, he was riding to a neighboring village to take advantage of the intimate services of local women. His wife was unaware of this, but in court he said that he had not intended to go there that night and had simply planned to ride to take his mind off family problems and difficulties on the farm. At one point, he noticed Marianne alone on an empty and dark road. Then it occurred to him that he could do whatever he wanted with her. Jasper drove up to her, took a penknife from his pocket, and threatened to silence her. He then took her to a field where he abused and killed her. At the trial, the man insisted that he did not mean to kill the young woman and did it out of panic. He realized what he had done and what the consequences would be for his entire family. His children were 5 and 8 years old at the time, and they were about to find out what their father had done. For this reason, Jasper decided to kill Marianne and go into hiding. But his conscience has been bothering him ever since. He continued to live in the area, listening to talk about the murder and seeing the family of his victim, whose lives would never be the same again because of his heinous act. Since then, he has repeated thoughts of turning himself into the police, but he's never made up his mind. When a massive DNA screening was announced in 2012, Jasper realized he would be figured out. He had so many relatives in the neighborhood, and one of them would certainly have turned in his DNA. Experts would find a partial match and start looking into all his relatives, which would inevitably lead to his capture. So Jasper decided to give his DNA. But he still couldn't bring himself to come to the police station and confess. The trial lasted only a few weeks, and on April 19th, the judge pronounced his sentence, 18 years in prison out of a possible 20 years under Dutch law. After 13 years, Marianne's relatives finally saw the perpetrator punished, but the judicial system gave them an unpleasant surprise. Due to his good behavior, Jasper is scheduled to be released as early as 2023, meaning he has spent less than 10 years behind bars. Angela Simoda was born on September 19, 1964, in Alameda, California. She was the youngest of 5 children. When she was 1 year old, her father died, and her mother raised them alone. After graduating from high school in 1982, Angela enrolled at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. She chose the Department of Computer Science and Electrical Engineering, which was not the most popular direction for young women at the time. Because of this, Angela was one of the few young women in her class, but this did not prevent her from studying excellently and moving towards her chosen career. Angela also had many friends, and later she started dating a guy named Ben McCall. He was several years older than her and worked in a managerial position at a construction company. During the first few years of study, Angela lived in a dormitory, and during this time, she and her roommate Sheila became best friends. At some point, Angela decided to rent an apartment near the university and chose a residential complex 5 minutes from the campus. In addition, she got a part-time job to cover the rental expenses. On the Friday evening of October 12, 1984, Angela decided to go to a bar with her friends. The young woman also invited her boyfriend, but he had to go to work the next morning, so he declined. As a result, Angela went with her friend Anita and their mutual acquaintance named Russell. They visited several bars and had a great time, after which they decided to go home around 1 a.m. Since Angela hardly drank alcohol, she agreed to drive her friends home. First, they dropped off Russell near his apartment. Anita originally wanted to stay overnight at Angela's, but she planned to attend a football match early in the morning, so Anita asked to be taken to the dormitory. After that, Angela decided to stop by her boyfriend's house for a few minutes. She went in for a few minutes and then went home. Her apartment was just a few blocks away from Ben's home. After saying goodbye to Angela, he went to bed, but he woke up 10 minutes later from a call on his home phone. It was Angela on the other end, and her voice sounded very worried. At first, she just asked him to talk to her, which seemed strange to him. He could hear some noise in the background and tried to find out from her what was going on. Soon she told him that some man knocked on her door and asked to use her phone and bathroom. Angela did not specify whether she let him in voluntarily or the man entered the apartment without her permission. She asked Ben, "Are there any convenience stores nearby with a payphone?" The guy looked up a suitable store in the directory and gave her the address. She repeated this information to the man and told Ben that she would call him back soon and hung up. But the call never came. Ben waited for a few minutes, then started calling her himself, but there was no answer. Then he got into his car and drove to her apartment. When he arrived at the house, he started knocking on her door, but there was only silence in response. Ben had a portable phone in his car that was given to him by the construction company. He dialed Angela's home number and walked back to her apartment. He heard the phone ringing, but no one answered. Then he thought that the young woman might have escorted the stranger to the convenience store with a payphone and decided to go there. But the salesperson said that no one had come to them, and Ben returned to Angela's apartment. He knocked on the door again and decided to call the police. It was almost half an hour before 2 policemen arrived at the house. Ben explained the situation to them and asked to open the door to Angela's apartment. But the officers did not rush to take any active action. They decided to contact the manager of the residential complex and ask him for a key before entering the apartment. The first thing the police officer saw was a shoe on the floor in the middle of the living room. Then they headed to the bedroom, where they saw a horrifying sight. Angela was lying in bed, surrounded by a lot of blood, and she was not wearing any clothes. The police officers immediately noticed multiple stab wounds on her body. Later, experts counted 18 injuries. Investigators started examining the crime scene and noticed several bloodstains in the bathroom, presuming that they could belong to the attacker. In addition, several fingerprints were found in the apartment, but they did not lead to any results. Detectives also determined that the perpetrator had taken a kitchen knife, which was presumably the murder weapon. There were no signs of a break-in, indicating that the victim had let the attacker in, which matched Ben's story about the strange phone call. Medical experts determined that the victim had been assaulted, and they were able to extract biological material from the attacker. Unfortunately, DNA analysis was not yet conducted in 1984, so the experts were only able to determine the attacker's blood type. Investigators began searching for a suspect, exploring all possible lines of investigation. First, they looked into all the employees of the residential complex who could have had access to the apartment. They then looked into men who had previously been convicted of violent crimes and lived in the area, but this also did not yield any results. Next, they focused on Angela's acquaintances and first interrogated her boyfriend. He told them about the phone call and the unknown man who came to see Angela. However, the detectives did not immediately believe him and considered the possibility that Ben may have killed her and made up the story. Nevertheless, the boyfriend agreed to provide his fingerprints and a blood sample. The experts determined his blood group, which did not match the killer's blood group. After talking to the victim's friends, the investigators identified another suspect, her ex-boyfriend, who she had dated in her hometown. According to her friends, he sometimes behaved aggressively and once even threatened her with a knife. His blood group did not match the killer's blood group, and he was no longer considered a suspect. The next suspect was Russell, who had spent time with Angela a few hours before her death. And here, the police received their first alarm. they could not locate him on the day after the murder. Digging deeper, they found out that on the morning of October 13, Russell attended a wedding of acquaintances, after which he flew to another city to visit relatives. When he returned home the next day, he was taken to the police station for questioning. The young man insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder, but investigators doubted his sincerity. Russell lived alone and couldn't confirm that he was in his apartment that night. Additionally, detectives learned that Russell had a crush on Angela. He was several years older than her and worked as an architect. They met through mutual friends shortly before her death, and Russell tried to ask her out on a date, but she told him she had a boyfriend, and they continued to communicate as friends. Detectives were also suspicious of the fact that Russell left town almost immediately after the murder. Given all of this, he quickly became the prime suspect. However, there were discrepancies in the new version of his involvement. According to Ben's story, an unfamiliar man came to Angela's apartment and was most likely the killer. Considering the timeline of events, no one else could have killed her and left the apartment. However, detectives did not base their investigation solely on Ben's story, as they simply could not confirm it. In the following weeks, Russell was called in for questioning repeatedly, and each time investigators became more convinced of his possible involvement. Some detectives even privately spoke with near certainty that he was the killer. Sheila, Angela's best friend, was deeply affected by the news of her death. She was so afraid to be alone that she had to move in with her parents, and for the first month after the murder, she even slept in the same room as them. At the same time, she almost constantly followed the progress of the investigation, constantly calling detectives and meeting with investigators. Sheila told them about Angela's friends and acquaintances, hoping to help get to the truth. During one of these meetings, a detective told her that Russell was most likely the killer, but they didn't have enough evidence to hold him accountable. He then asked Sheila to meet with him and ask him a series of friendly questions, such as, "What were you doing a few days before and after the murder?" Investigators wanted to verify if his story matched what he told them. A hidden microphone was attached to Sheila before the meeting. The young man told Sheila the same story, but the detectives didn't plan on giving up. They called him in for questioning again at the station and offered to conduct a polygraph test. Russell agreed and successfully passed it, but the investigators continued to consider him the murderer. They were so convinced of their rightness that during the interrogation, they showed the boy photos of Angela's body, hoping that this gruesome sight would break him. But all of this yielded no results, and Russell continued to insist on his innocence. After 6 months of constant questioning, he hired a lawyer and refused to communicate with the police personally. After that, detectives placed him under round-the-clock surveillance, but eventually had to switch their attention to searching for other suspects. Russell left for London to receive additional education in architecture, and the investigators lost the ability to monitor him during all that time. The Angela case was actively covered in the media, and her relatives offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that could help find the killer, but this also yielded no results. During the investigation, the police had another suspect, a student at the same university as Angela. Investigators received an unconfirmed lead that this guy allegedly had a crush on the young woman and wrote her angry letters a few weeks before the murder. However, the detectives were unable to confirm any of this, and the young man had a reliable alibi. Since then, the case remained unsolved for many years, with no new leads appearing for the police, and all the old leads leading nowhere. After 10 years of silence, Sheila decided to call the police station and inquire about the progress of the investigation. By that time, she had already gotten married and had 2 children. Despite the fact that her life continued, she could not forget the tragic fate of her best friend and the fact that the guilty party still had not been punished. She spoke with the detectives, but they said that there had been no developments in the case. Sheila asked, "Have they tried to extract DNA samples from the killer's biological material?" After all, it was already 1994, and DNA analysis technology was actively used by the police. However, investigators stated that the evidence in this case had been lost and could not be recovered. Sheila was not satisfied with these answers and continued to regularly call the detectives. Over the course of several years, she made over 700 calls, but each time she received generic responses. She even tried to independently pay for DNA analysis of all remaining evidence in a private laboratory, but was not allowed to do so. The problem was that she had no connection to the police and was an ordinary citizen, so her initiative was not taken seriously. Then, Sheila came up with an idea. She thought about obtaining a private detective license. In her opinion, this would allow her to have more useful influence on the course of the investigation, and she began to study this issue. The woman began to study hard, and after several months, she successfully passed the exam and obtained her license. Despite this, she was unable to convince the investigators to reopen the case. She continued to make regular calls until July 2006, when Angela's case was transferred to a new unit specializing in unsolved murders. Sheila met with the chief detective and they began to work on the case together. To her surprise, she learned that the DNA sample from the victim's body had not actually disappeared and had been in the laboratory all these years. Apparently, she had been intentionally lied to because she had tired the investigators with her calls. Sheila convinced the new detective to send the DNA sample for analysis, and it finally happened. However, due to queues and bureaucracy, they had to wait almost 2 years for the results. On February 14, 2008, the detective received the DNA profile of the killer and entered it into the FBI database. He immediately saw a 100% match, and after 24 years, they had the killer's name. When the detective called Sheila and told her about it, she expected to hear that Russell was the killer after all. But to her surprise, the detective gave her an entirely unfamiliar name. The DNA from Angela's body matched the sample of a certain Donald Andrew Bess. The man, who was already over 60 at the time, was in prison for a series of rapes. In 1977, Donald abducted a young woman and subjected her to violence, for which he received 25 years in prison. As is often the case, he was released early. He was released from prison after 7 years in the beginning of 1984, when he was 36 years old. In that same year, he killed Angela and remained unpunished for decades. In 1985, he assaulted another woman and was caught by the police. The fact that he was on parole at the time of the crime became an aggravating factor, and Donald was sentenced to life imprisonment. Thus, he ended up in prison a year after Angela's murder. After gathering all the necessary information, detectives came to the correctional facility to conduct an interrogation. Donald denied his involvement in Angela's murder and insisted that he had never harmed women. Of course, the investigators were not quick to believe him, as his semen was found on the victim's body, but the man was not eager to give a confession, and the case began to be prepared for trial. The start of the trial had to be postponed due to serious health problems Donald had. A few days before the hearing, he had a heart attack. As a result, the trial began only on June 2, 2010. Donald continued to insist that he had not killed anyone, but the DNA test results spoke for themselves. His lawyer tried to emphasize his health problems and good behavior in prison in order to secure a lighter sentence for Donald. The prosecution, in turn, asked for the death penalty. According to the investigators, Donald noticed Angela in one of the bars or on the street, after which he began to follow her. When she arrived home, he knocked on her apartment door and asked to use the phone and the toilet. After the young woman called her boyfriend and hung up, Donald attacked her and assaulted her. Detectives believe that the criminal was still in Angela's apartment when her boyfriend arrived and started knocking on the door, and Donald may have been afraid that his victim would scream. So he inflicted multiple stab wounds. After waiting for her boyfriend to leave, he left the apartment. The trial was heavily covered in the news, and this led to some unexpected consequences. Several women immediately went to the police and said that Donald Bess had subjected them to violence at different times. One of them was his ex-wife, who told the court about constant beatings from Donald. He raised his hand on her even when she was pregnant with his child, and after the birth of their daughter, he continued to physically abuse her. The wife had to run away and hide, fearing for the life of her child. As a result, the jury found him guilty of the murder of Angela, and he was sentenced to death. He attempted to appeal the court's decision several times, but failed. Donald spent 12 more years in prison, and during that time, his execution date was never set. However, in October 2022, he died a natural death. Another heart attack proved fatal. Thus, this complicated case came to an end. Investigators acknowledged that Sheila played a crucial role in moving the investigation forward by not giving up in her pursuit of the truth. After her story was publicized, relatives of other victims whose cases had gone unsolved for years began to reach out to her. As a result, Sheila decided to help these people and established a non-profit organization. Regarding Russell, the police department officially apologized to him for the months of persecution. He admitted that it had significantly affected his life, and he was genuinely afraid of being convicted of a crime he did not commit. Despite this, he continued to try to help the police get to the bottom of the case. After all of these events, he became a well-known architect in Dallas. One aspect of the story that still troubles investigators is the possibility that Donald may have had many more victims, even though he spent half of his life in prison. Perhaps, sooner or later, they will be able to link him to other crimes. Gemma McCluskey was born on February 5, 1983, in England. She grew up in a large family. The girl had 2 older brothers and loving parents. In her teenage years, Gemma decided to try herself as an actress, and in 1997, she got a few minor roles. In 2000, when she was 17, she was offered a role in one of the most popular British TV series called EastEnders. In total, Gemma appeared in more than 30 episodes. After that, she had to temporarily give up her acting career because her mother became seriously ill and someone had to take care of her. The woman was diagnosed with a brain tumor, which was successfully operated on, but unfortunately, she got infected during the operation, which could not be treated. Since then, Gemma lived in an apartment with her mother and brother Tony. She worked as a waitress in several bars and clubs, and her brother took care of their mother in her absence. In March 2012, when Gemma was 29, she was, as usual, taking care of her mother, going to work, and occasionally meeting with friends. But one day, her acquaintances realized that no one could reach Gemma. She didn't answer her phone, didn't respond to messages on social media, and didn't appear online. She had quite a few friends, and they quickly suspected something was wrong. Together, they concluded that no one had seen Gemma for several days. The last time she met with her friend, Erica, was on March 1st, and since then, Gemma had not been seen or heard from. On March 3rd, her brother went to the club where she was supposed to work that day, but the staff said that Gemma never showed up. That's when Tony and his brother, Danny, decided to go to the police. They knew that their sister would never leave their sick mother without warning, so they doubted that she had just left on her own. Investigators received a report of a missing person and first questioned Tony, whose testimony was crucial as he lived with Gemma and could have been the last person to see her. However, there was a problem. For many years, Tony had been using marijuana in large quantities, and the entire family knew about his addiction. Because of this habit, he constantly experienced problems with memory and concentration, so he couldn't even remember the specific day he last saw Gemma. Eventually, he remembered seeing his sister on March 1st. On that day, as usual, he had consumed a large amount of marijuana and nearly caused a flood in the apartment. Tony decided to fill the bathtub and forgot about it, causing water to overflow. But luckily, Gemma was home and turned off the water. After that, she left the apartment to meet her friend Erica. Tony said he left his room around 6 p.m. and his sister was still missing. Gemma and Erica discussed the bathtub incident, and Gemma once again complained about how tired she was of her brother's behavior. He worked as a window cleaner, but spent almost all his money on marijuana, even though he was 35 years old, and Gemma often felt like she had to constantly look after him. The next day, after reporting to the police, Erica met with Tony to discuss the situation again and try to think together about where his sister could have gone. The man was depressed, often started crying, and blamed himself for what had happened. He said that because of the bathtub incident, Gemma once again became disappointed in him. It was not the first time that his addiction had upset his relatives. Meanwhile, Gemma's friends turned to the local newspaper, asking to write about her disappearance. Reporters spoke to Gemma's brother and wrote an article. Everyone hoped that media coverage would help find witnesses who might have seen the woman. On March 5th, Gemma's cousins decided to organize large-scale searches. They attracted dozens of volunteers who searched the streets and handed out flyers to passerby. The sisters also actively disseminated information through social networks, hoping to get any leads. On March 6th, they did receive their first lead, but not in the form they had hoped. Tony received a call from an unknown number, telling him that if he wanted to see his sister alive, he needed to bring £2 million sterling to the Benefit railway station, located outside of London. Shortly after, there was a second call from the same unknown person, stating that in addition to the money, he also needed to bring $500 in Iraqi currency. After this, there was a third call, in which the mysterious person threatened to kill Gemma if they didn't get the money. Tony asked to speak to his sister, but the caller said that she was locked in another room and added that the woman was regularly subjected to violence, so he advised Tony to hurry with the money. The same person also called Danny, the missing woman's other brother. The police tried to trace these calls. Despite the fact that the number was hidden in all cases, they quickly managed to find the caller. He was a 19-year-old boy named Sam Dunn, who lived in Kent County. His home was relatively close to the railway station where the caller demanded the money to be brought. A judge issued a search warrant for his home, and Dunn was arrested. However, soon after, the police came to the conclusion that the boy had nothing to do with Gemma's disappearance, as he admitted during interrogation. He and his friends saw a post on social media about the woman's disappearance and decided to play a prank. There were two numbers, Tony and Danny. However, investigators quickly discovered that there were inaccuracies in this story as well. The boy said that the calls were made by his friend, and he was just sitting next to him. The police established that the caller was actually Sam and could not find any other people involved. As a result, the court did not appreciate his joke and sentenced the boy to 6 months in prison. The detectives once again had no leads. They recreated the chronology of that day and established that Gemma left Erica's apartment at around 13:17 and went home along the way. She called Tony several times and arrived at her home at 13:50. This was confirmed by CCTV footage. After 18 minutes, her phone was turned off, and it had not been turned on since. At that point, the police were almost certain that Gemma had been abducted, but there was something strange about the timing of her movements. Most likely, her abductor had turned off her phone. But how could he have done that 18 minutes after the woman arrived home? The most logical explanation would be that Gemma was attacked right in her apartment. But at that time, Tony was there, and their mother was in the hospital. Investigators came to an alarming conclusion and thought, could her own brother have something to do with her disappearance? He consumed a lot of weed, and people with serious addictions are often capable of monstrous acts. Digging deeper, detectives learned that Gemma's sister and mother had called the police on Tony several times. Sometimes he behaved aggressively and even attacked Gemma. The brothers' behavior during the investigation also raised questions. While Denny and Gemma's friends were actively involved in the search, Tony sat at home. He explained that he hoped for Gemma's return and wanted to be at home in case she came back. Only after the case began to be talked about on major TV channels did he finally join the search. Police spoke to him again, trying to get more specific answers about the timeline of events on that day. Tony said he saw his sister between 1:30 p.m. and 3 p.m., and after that she went somewhere. Considering that her phone was turned off at 2:08 p.m., his story raised questions. On the other hand, Tony was under the influence of weed almost 24/7, and relying on his memory would not be entirely objective. On March 6th, 5 days after Gemma's disappearance, there was an extremely alarming turn in the case. A boatman was sailing along one of London's canals, and at some point a suitcase hit his boat. Upon collision, it opened, and the shocked boatman saw its contents. There was a human body inside. Experts examined it and immediately noticed that the torso was missing its head, legs, and arms. It was a female body with a bow tattoo on the lower back, the same as Gemma's. So investigators immediately requested DNA analysis to identify the body. They took DNA from her toothbrush and obtained a complete match. The deceased was Gemma McCluskey. Her relatives and friends were shocked by the news of the woman's death and the gruesome details of her body being found in a suitcase. No one could believe that something so terrible had happened to her. Now the police were dealing with a murder case, and everyone was waiting for them to catch the culprit. The very next day, on March 7th, they made a loud statement. Investigators announced that Tony McCluskey had been arrested on suspicion of murder. His inability to remember the timeline of that day and strange behavior during the search for Gemma suggested that he was not at all interested in finding his own sister, or he knew that she was already dead. In addition, the time frame of her disappearance made Tony the most obvious suspect. Given that he had a fight about the overflowing bathtub that day, as well as his known addiction, police assumed that he might have snapped and killed his sister. The use of marijuana in large quantities over a long period of time can lead to serious mental problems, and a person is fully capable of committing spontaneous crimes. During the first interrogation, detectives became even more convinced that Tony could indeed be the killer. Instead of denying his guilt in his sister's murder, he answered all questions with one short phrase: "No comment." Investigators examined his smartphone, where they found correspondence with his sister. The day after her disappearance, he sent Gemma a message saying, "I love you." And a few hours later, he wrote, "Gem, call me when you get this message. What do we have for dinner today? Are you working tonight?" Detectives noticed one strange fact. Their correspondence with his sister dated back many years, but he never once wrote that he loved her, only on the day after her disappearance. On the same day, he wrote to his girlfriend and apologized for not getting in touch with her the night before. None of this pointed to his guilt, but soon police found much more serious evidence. They learned that on the day of Gemma's disappearance, Tony ordered a taxi to an address near the house using a fake name, Tom. Learning the route from the company, investigators obtained recordings from surveillance cameras in the area. On the first frames of the footage taken during the man's taxi ride, they saw Tony loading a large suitcase into the trunk. It was clear that it was very heavy, and the driver's testimony confirmed this fact. Seeing the man struggling to lift the suitcase, he asked him, "What's inside?" Tony claimed it was a large music system. He asked to be taken to the street next to the canal, where his sister's body would later be found. After questioning the locals in the area, the police found one witness, a student who was standing on the balcony of her apartment, saw a man dragging a large suitcase towards the canal. Experts examined the taxi trunk and found traces of blood. DNA analysis showed that it belonged to Gemma. With these clues in hand, detectives were convinced that Tony was transporting the same suitcase with his sister's body, and on March 10th, he was charged with murder. The police conducted a search of their apartment and found even more alarming evidence: a knife with barely noticeable traces of blood, and there were also blood stains in the bathroom that they tried to wash away. All of this indicated that the woman was killed in her own home, but one moment raised questions for the detectives. Given that the woman's head, arms, and legs were separated from the body, there should have been much more blood. Experts studied the drainage pipes throughout the house, but they did not find significant traces of blood there. They speculated that Tony laid something like plastic wrap or tarp on the bathroom floor, and then gradually disposed of the blood with a large amount of cleaning agents. The day after the murder, Tony was caught on store cameras buying trash bags. According to investigators, he could use them to carry out the remaining parts of the body from the house. Soon, this version was confirmed. Divers who continued to search the canal found bags with legs and arms at the bottom of the same canal. Even without DNA analysis, everyone already understood that they belonged to Gemma, and later, laboratory experts only confirmed this fact. Despite a serious set of evidence against Tony, he still did not speak to investigators, and they decided to change tactics. The police showed his father footage from cameras where Tony was seen putting the suitcase in the taxi trunk on the day of Gemma's murder. The father was convinced that his son was involved in the murder, so he agreed to talk to him and try to get a confession. This tactic worked, but only partially. During the conversation, Tony told his father what had happened that day. According to him, Gemma came home and started to fight over the bathtub being full, demanding that her brother move out of her apartment, but he refused. When Tony decided to go to his room, Gemma allegedly grabbed a knife and he didn't remember anything after that. Investigators didn't believe this story for a second, as it sounded like an attempt to shift the blame for the murder. Therefore, they continued to search for additional evidence. On March 9th, police found Gemma's head in the same canal, and experts were finally able to determine the cause of death. The woman had received several blows with a sharp object, and the injuries matched the kitchen knife found in her apartment. Since then, detectives have been preparing the case for trial, and Tony has been in custody. The trial lasted almost a year, during which time the victim's brother gradually began to admit his guilt. He constantly exchanged letters with his father, who had continued to insist that he didn't remember the moment of the murder. Nevertheless, Tony admitted that he was the one who killed his sister. According to him, during the argument, he essentially blacked out and couldn't control himself. Tony insisted that he never wanted his sister to die and couldn't have done such a thing in a sane state of mind. The trial began in January 2013. The prosecution believed that Tony flew into rage during the argument with his sister when she asked him to move out of the apartment. Given his penchant for marijuana, he simply wouldn't have had enough money to rent his own place. Perhaps this played a significant role in what happened next. Based on the experts' conclusions, The prosecution claimed that Tony stabbed his sister several times, leading to her death. He then laid something like a tarp in the bathroom and took the body there, after which he dismembered it. Based on CCTV footage, Tony put Gemma's torso in a suitcase and threw it into the canal. After that, he carried other body parts and other evidence in garbage bags over several trips, some of which he also threw into the water. His father couldn't even bear to listen to it all. He left the courtroom and only returned after they stopped discussing the details of his daughter's murder. Tony himself admitted that he was most likely the one who killed Gemma, but he didn't remember it at all. According to him, it could have been self-defense, as his sister allegedly shouted at him with a knife in her hand, and what happened next was unknown. The prosecution considered his version to be a blatant lie. A psychotherapist was invited as a witness who claimed that memory loss due to marijuana use is extremely rare. In addition, Tony clearly planned to hide what he had done by getting rid of the body. It took him many hours, and amnesia and a state of shock should have passed fairly quickly. Not only did he dismember her body and scatter it around different places of the canal, but he also called a taxi under a false name and thoroughly cleaned the bathroom floor afterward. All of this indicated that Tony was fully aware of what he was doing and planned to avoid punishment by getting rid of all possible evidence. Gemma's childhood friend also testified in court, revealing that her brother had been beating and humiliating her from an early age. Sometimes Gemma had to wear sunglasses to hide the signs of physical abuse. According to the witness, Tony always despised his sister and felt no emotions toward her. He lived with her and their mother only because it was convenient for him. He didn't have to pay rent or even for food. Tony spent almost all of his salary on weed, and this lifestyle suited him perfectly. But when his sister tried to kick him out, he snapped and killed her. The trial ended on January 30th, and the jury found Tony guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 20 years. In his closing statement, the judge said that Tony disposed of the victim's body like a true maniac and apparently hoped it would never be found. The killer showed no emotion during the reading of the verdict or the trial itself. There was no evidence that he felt any remorse for what he had done. After Tony began serving his sentence, he was transferred from one prison to another because someone had put a price on his head. It is unknown whether this was related to the murder of Gemma or if he had quarreled with other inmates. Tony's father, who had tried to support his son throughout the trial, ultimately decided to cut off all contact with him. The man said that he did not want to turn away from Tony, as he would lose 2 children at once, and besides, he was his own son, and he simply could not abandon him. But in the end, he realized that Tony felt no remorse for what he had done. He didn't care about his own sister at all. In the same year, their mother passed away after a prolonged illness, but even then, Tony did not seem to have any strong feelings. It appeared that his own family did not matter to him at all. The worst part is that none of this can be blamed on drug addiction. He had been humiliating and abusing Gemma since childhood, so there is no justification for what he did. Tony's brother and father are forced to live the rest of their lives with the realization of what kind of monster Tony really is.